Chapter 364. In Dismark's favorite hot spring, a large number of elves and orcs had gathered. However, the elves outnumbered the orcs by several times, and almost all of their important figures had arrived. Behind great elder Uptila stood dozens of senators, while Prudence stood behind Uptila. Gaubin and Lydia were also there. In comparison, the orcs were much weaker, with only about 1,000 orc warriors. On the edge of the hot spring, there were hundreds of corpses of both elves and orcs, showing the consequences of the conflict. Most of the elven corpses were covered with woven grass blanket. As long as it was within their power, the elves would not abandon the corpses of their companions. On the other hand, the orcs were much more indifferent. They just let the corpses of their companions lie on the ground, not caring at all. In front of the beastmen's battle formation, there were more than 200 beastmen kneeling there motionlessly with their heads down. There were even shamans among them. The situation was very strange. It was reasonable to say that as the only group of wise beastmen, shamans should have outstanding self-control. However, they were like ordinary beastmen. After arriving at the scene, they completely lost control and joined in the violence. "Sorry, I'm really sorry." The leader of the orcs bowed deeply to Uptila and all the elders of the elves. "An apology is enough?" Gaubin said coldly. The orc commander slowly raised his head and looked at Gaubin. The fangs that extended from his mouth were only as long as a finger, which showed that he was not very old. He was at most 40 years old. He only wore ordinary armor without any accessories, which was a sharp contrast to the guards behind him who were full of gold and silver jewelry. The orc commander's clothes were not in line with the orc tradition. However, no matter how ordinary he looked, Uptila, Prudence, Gaubin, and Lydia did not dare to underestimate him. They all knew the identity of the orc commander. He was Forza's favorite eldest son, Lionel. He was also the supreme commander of the orc reinforcements. "Mr. Gaubin, you should know that this misunderstanding was caused by someone." Lionel pointed to a place. "Those elves were killed in a very clever and cruel way. It was not done by us orcs. I know someone is playing tricks in the dark, but that person didn't ask you to taint the elves." Lionel was at a loss for words. He had investigated for a long time, but he still could not find the reason why the orcs and shamans collectively lost control. In the face of Gaubin's question, he was speechless. He could only turn his attention to Ampugula, hoping that Ampugula could come forward to ease the situation. However, Updura avoided Lionel's gaze. The great elder of the Senate was different from the Lord. He could not hide the truth from the masses. The society formed by the elves was also a relatively democratic society. Gaubin's words represented the anger of the majority of the elves. If Updura's attitude was slightly weaker, it would definitely have a very bad impact on him. Lionel was a little disappointed when he saw that Ampugula didn't say anything. He slowly said, "Sir Gaubin, many of our people have died as well. They deserved it." Gaubin said word by word, "I'm very curious. Did you come here personally just to quibble and clear the name of the orcs? Then, there's nothing to talk about between us." "Okay." Lionel took a deep look at Gaubin and suddenly waved his hand. His guards neatly pulled out their shiny scimitars. Before the orcs kneeling on the ground could react, the scimitars had already slashed down. More than 200 heads flew up almost at the same time. The splashing blood formed a bloody wave, and then more than 200 headless corpses fell to the ground one after another. The sneer on Gaubin's face disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. His beautiful pupils shrank to the size of a needle at the same time, and his lips were tightly pressed together. He had already captured some information from this cruel scene, and also came to a conclusion. No matter what he said, it was meaningless. "Sir Gaubin, are you satisfied?" Lionel said faintly. "Okay, it's all a misunderstanding." Ampugula finally spoke. Lionel had already given an explanation, and he believed that most of the elves were satisfied with this result. How could they become enemies with the orcs over such a small matter? Yes, great Elder Ampugula. In fact, I also don't want to see this kind of thing happen. Lionel paused, and from those elves I saw a familiar figure. Who is it? An old guy named Gale. Lionel said softly, we can't let this war continue. I've decided to launch an all-out attack on the Holy Crown City from the day after tomorrow. Great. Ampugula said happily, now the weather has become warmer, and the elven warriors can cooperate with you to launch the attack. Then I'll take my leave first. Lionel bowed. There are many things to prepare. Lionel waved his hand, and the orc warriors jumped on the wind wolves and galloped to the other side of the canyon. The elven warriors who had surrounded the orcs made way for them. The other side had punished all the criminals, and they had gotten the result they wanted. They had no intention of letting the conflict continue to expand. Gaubin had been staring at Lionel's back, lost in thought. One of his hands was slowly groping in his pocket. Lydia, who was beside him, smiled and handed over a wine bag. Gaubin didn't smile. He took the wine bag, raised his head, and gulped it down. The elves also liked wine, but they also needed to pay attention to their manners when drinking. What Gaubin was doing was not drinking, but pouring wine. In the blink of an eye, Gaubin finished all the wine in the wineskin. Then, he tossed the wineskin back to Lydia. As he breathed, a faint smell of alcohol wafted out. Uptula couldn't help but frown. Great Elder Ampugula, are you really ready for this war? Gaubin suddenly asked. Of course, I've been waiting for this day for a long time. Ampugula said, Prudence is the commander, so we can't be as reckless as before. Gaubin, when the time comes, you will cooperate with the orcs in the first battle. No problem. Gaubin revealed a hearty smile, but his eyes were exceptionally sharp, and there was not even the slightest hint of a smile. Ampugula felt that something was wrong. He thought for a while and didn't say anything. Then, he led the elders in the opposite direction. The elven warriors gathered around and cleaned up the corpses of their companions. As for the orcs, they didn't care about them at all. In the end, they just set fire to them. Groups of elven warriors retreated, leaving only Gaubin and Lydia behind. Gaubin seemed to be thinking about something, while Lydia was waiting for Gaubin. She was used to this kind of thing. Gaubin often thought about his own matters in inappropriate places or at inappropriate times. Lydia knew very well that Gaubin had aroused Prudence's jealousy, so she didn't dare to leave for a moment. She was afraid that Prudence would take advantage of this opportunity to take advantage of her. After some time, Gaubin slowly raised his head. I remember I told you before that I don't want to bleed. What? You changed your mind now? Lydia was stunned. I can't, not anymore. Gaubin's tone was a bit heavy. His eyes flickered. I know Ampugula. He's good at infighting, and only infighting. Believe it or not, even if all the elves on the continent gathered together and re-established the Senate, he would still be the great elder. No one would be able to compete with him. I believe everything you say. Lydia smiled. Lydia, I'm not in the mood to joke. I'm not joking. Lydia's tone sounded like she was blaming Soren. Ha. Gaubin smiled bitterly. But when it comes to foreign affairs, Ampugula is too naive. He would rather believe in fairy tales that the situation is getting better and better than face the possible crisis. Crisis? What do you mean? The orcs are too rough. They're too lazy to dress themselves up. You're the same. If it was in the past, Gaubin would definitely tease Lydia. At least he wouldn't just take a beating and not fight back. But now, he wasn't in the mood to joke at all. He slowly said, I'm talking about the details. Did you notice the scene when Lionel gave the order? Those orc warriors raised their scimitars at the same time. This proves that they already knew that Lionel had set the final bottom line. What does this mean? Lydia asked. Lionel didn't come here in a hurry. He had thought it through beforehand. Gaubin said, the most important thing is, Where did he get the authority to execute more than a dozen shamans at once? Lionel is the eldest son of Forza. This authority, no. Gaobin interrupted. You still don't understand the status of the shamans among the orcs. No matter what kind of serious crime they have committed, if you want to execute a shaman, you have to get Forza's approval. Just like when we want to punish a great elf, in addition to getting the approval of the tribe leader, we also have to get a vote from the Senate. Forza also knows about this. Lydia frowned. Impossible. Fado City is thousands of miles away from here. How could Forza know? What if Forza is here? Gaobin asked. What? Lydia was shocked. Although she already knew that Gaobin would come up with some strange ideas, this judgment was still too absurd. It's even more impossible. Forza is here? Doesn't he want his own Fado City? Yes. Doesn't he want his own Fado City? Gaobin's eyes became confused. It's exactly because I can't answer the question that I didn't warn Ampugula. However, I believe in my own feelings. I can also smell the intense smell of blood in the gentle morning breeze. Lydia became silent. As usual, she wouldn't waste too much energy on things that she couldn't understand or understand. She just waited for Gaobin to make a decision. Her mission was to carry it out. Lydia, go get ready, Gaobin said in a very slow voice. You want to, yes. Gaobin nodded slowly. Now. Lydia's face was slightly red, and even the ugly scar on her face became shiny. No, tonight, I will find a chance to talk to Abdurrah for the last time. If I still can't convince him. Gaobin was silent for a long time. Then, I won't let an elf that I don't trust control the future of the elves. Kane finally finished telling the whole story. Julia's face changed again and again, and her body swayed back and forth. She had to rely on Gibran's support to maintain her standing posture. Gibran's face was also pale. The two of them never thought that so many complicated and terrible things had happened in the past few months. Because Kane had to take Julia's feelings into consideration, his narration was not biased. He didn't side with the humans or the elves. He only told the truth, and the truth itself was irrefutable. So, Constance was even more uneasy. She knew a lot of inside information. It turned out that the human lord and Sunir were a couple. It turned out that Prudence was so despicable that he used Sunir to set up a trap and attacked Han Jin with Dragon City's elder Maxwell. In the end, they failed. This made Prudence look even more like a clown. And the elves, who had been silent for a long time, finally stepped onto the stage as invaders for the first time. Their goal was to conquer the entire continent. Was this really the right thing to do? Julia, forgive me. I asked Kane to lie to you. Han Jin said softly. I hope you can understand. I just wanted to protect you. I didn't want you and Gibran to have to face this. I know. Julia said with a trembling voice. Raphael, tell me, do you really believe that Sunir betrayed you? Han Jin was stunned. After a while, he said slowly, there's no point in saying this now. There is a point. And you didn't answer my question. Julia pressed on. Do you really believe that Sunir would marry Prudence? Constance looked at Julia in shock. Even if she hated the human lord to the core, she still had to use honorifics. Julia's attitude was too presumptuous. She was worried that Julia would anger Han Jin. But to Gibran, Lang Ning, and the others, everything was normal. The reason Lang Ning used honorifics was because he insisted that there should be a hierarchy. And the situation was a little special at that time. The soldiers of Riptide were not willing to obey Han Jin. He had to show his attitude firmly. As for Morrison's, Sasu, and the others, Han Jin's childhood friends did not know how to use honorifics, and Han Jin himself did not like it. Han Jin did not know how to answer. His gaze was also avoiding Julia's. I know Sunir. She has a very strong personality. You should know her better than I do. Julia said word by word. Do you really think she will bow under pressure? Do you mean? I alone can compare to the future of the elves? Han Jin smiled bitterly. Bullshit! Julia screamed. Constance was shocked. Even Gibran felt that something was wrong. He quickly asked, Julia, what's wrong? Can someone tell me that the god of war, Abraham, is an elf? Julia's attitude was still very intense. The room was silent. For countless years, the elves had emphasized the purity of the blood of the descendants of the gods, but deliberately downplayed the fact that Abraham was a human. But now, Julia's words had enlightened them. After a long while, Lang Ning said softly, Julia, the Lord has already said that there is no point in talking about this anymore. Sunir deliberately led the Lord into the trap set by Prudence and Maxwell, right? You believe it? Julia sneered. But I don't. With that, she turned and rushed out. Julia! Gibran hurriedly grabbed Julia. Where are you going? I want to ask Sunir face to face what happened. Julia shouted. Let go of me. Julia, I asked Cain to bring you here so that you can go back. Han Jin said softly. But it's not for Sunir. You have something more important to do. The elves are facing an unprecedented crisis. Danger. Julia suddenly turned her head. The orcs. Perhaps in a few days the orcs will attack the elves. Han Jin thought for a moment. Julia, do you know the great elder, Amphila? What? Are you serious? Constance finally could not help but jump up. She had been shocked too many times today. Han Jin ignored Constance and only stared at Julia. Julia was also shocked, but her emotions were much more stable. She thought for a moment and shook her head. Do you have a way to meet him? I know Lydia very well. She should be able to help me. That's good. Han Jin took out a letter and placed it on the table. Just give this to him. As for whether he believes it or not, it's up to fate. Julia silently walked over and took the letter in her hand. Han Jin's eyes fell on Constance. To show my sincerity, Julia, take her back. There are now tens of thousands of elven prisoners in the Holy Crown City. I plan to release them in batches soon. Tell Amphila that if he really cherishes his people, it's best to send a few messengers to talk to me. Julia glanced at Constance and whispered, I got it. Also, Julia, you have to take care of yourself. Han Jin paused. You have to understand that you are an elf, not my messenger. Do you understand what I mean? Julia slowly nodded. All right, it's getting late. You should go. Han Jin waved his hand, and a talisman that he had already prepared shot out. It turned into a white light and disappeared into Julia's body. Gibran, you can't go with us. Otherwise, you will bring danger to Julia. Gibran smiled bitterly, but he didn't refute. Han Jin's meaning was obvious. Julia was an elf, not a human messenger. Only by maintaining this attitude would she be able to gain their trust. If he followed along and was discovered by the elves, the consequences would be unpredictable. Chapter 365. Under the cover of the night, squads of orc warriors quietly left their camps and headed towards the depths of the plains. What they were launching was a surprise attack-type war. After the bloody incident, Forza knew that he had no time to wait. Although he had instructed Lionel to kill all the orc warriors and shamans who committed the crime, he was very clear that the estrangement between the orcs and the elves had been formed. For example, in the past, when orc patrols met with elf patrols, they would greet each other in a friendly manner and then go their separate ways. Now that the two patrols met again, the elves would inevitably be on high alert. Who knew if they would encounter orcs who had lost control? As time went by, this estrangement would become deeper and deeper, and the elves' vigilance would become higher and higher. He had no more chances. The reason why the orcs had endured for nearly 2 months was that Forza was determined to maintain his strength. He hoped to wipe out the main force of the elves at a small cost. Forza's imaginary enemy was not only the elves, but also the Holy Crown City, Depew City, Cold Shadow City, and Solomon, which Forza regarded as a strong enemy. With so many opponents waiting for him to conquer, if he did not cherish his strength, the orcs would not be able to go far. However, Forza, who wanted to take the initiative, had to admit that he was not ready for a full-scale war. Of course, the elves were not ready either. In a valley, Blanche, who had been elected as the chief of the southwest region, was strolling with a few other elves. Because she was very close to Lydia, Prudence was very disgusted with Blanche. He had always arranged for the southwest region's elves to stay in an insignificant place, and even wanted to divide the southwest region's elves into other tribes. However, his proposal was firmly opposed by the southwest region's elves, and in the end, he could only let it go. The elf tribes in the southwest region held important positions in Lola's alliance, and their strength was not to be underestimated. However, they suffered a great loss from Nicholas's sudden attack, and they did not even have a single seat in the joint senate that Updura proposed. This was a great blow to their self-esteem. Therefore, they did not have any sense of mission or identity when Updura talked about the opportunity. Since they were already excluded from the core of power, no matter how magnificent Updura's blueprint was, it would not be able to attract them. Prudence's vigilance against them was exactly what Blanche wanted. She did not want to be involved in this war at all. Besides, the treatment of her friends in the Council of Elders that Abdullah knew had angered her. Lola and little Louise were both mixed-race children. They were the descendants of elves and humans. At the most critical moment, Lola forced little Louise to leave Moonlight City with Blanche. In the end, little Louise followed Blanche here. However, Updura showed his contempt and distrust of the half-elves. He even imprisoned little Louise, Panven, and the others who accompanied her. Blanche argued several times, but she could not convince Updura. The situation was stronger than her, and she could not forcibly attack the prison. She could only suppress her anger in her heart. It could also be said that the elves led by Blanche and the United Senate represented by Updura appeared to be united in appearance, but were actually divided at heart. Updura had long since given the order to prepare for the spring offensive, but Blanche's camp was filled with a relaxed atmosphere. Nobody took the war seriously, and they wouldn't do anything either. Today, Blanche had gathered the patriarchs of the various tribes together to discuss something important. In the previous war, Blanche's moon spring water had played a significant role. Without Blanche, there wouldn't have been so many trees of life growing in various cities. Apudula represented the United Senate to ask Blanche in exchange for 5 seats, but not for the moon spring water, but for the fog flower. If a fog flower was planted in a deep well, the well would have a magical power. The water in the well could make the seeds of life quickly take root and sprout. In fact, the ancient tree of life in Wild Willow City could drop hundreds of seeds of life every year. However, without moon spring water, the seeds would not change, no matter how long they were planted. Blanche only had one misty flower left in her hand. This flower was very strange. It seemed to bloom and bear fruit once every tens of thousands of years. Even the oldest elf didn't know the exact origin of the misty flower. In the old elven ballad, when the goddess of nature left this world and forcefully broke the restraints of the laws and stepped into her own divine realm, she kissed a few wildflowers. From then on, the wildflowers changed, becoming half-real and half-illusory existences. You could see them clearly, but you couldn't touch them with your hands. If you blew air out of your mouth, the flowers would sway and dance with the wind as if they really grew there. As for how to take care of and move the fog flower, only Blanche knew. This was the main reason why Ampugula wanted to negotiate with Blanche. In fact, there was no need to negotiate. Blanche would never hand over the fog flower. The problem was that they could not refuse directly. They had to come up with a suitable excuse. At this moment, a young female elf ran over in a panic and shouted from afar, "Sister Blanche, quick, quick, it's not good." "Trish, slow down. What's not good?" Blanche was stunned. The female elf almost fell into Blanche's arms. She barely steadied herself and panted. Then, she said anxiously, The beast men are attacking us. Sister Blanche, quick, or it will be too late. The beast men are attacking us? What kind of joke is this? Why would they attack us? Blanche's face was full of disbelief. How can you not believe it? It was your friend who asked me to tell you. Trish cried. My friend? Where is he? He's a human. How dare he come to us? Human? Blanche was even more suspicious. What kind of human is he? Trish paused and thought for a moment. He's a young man with a lot of flavor. Little one, you know what flavor is? Another elf couldn't help but cover her mouth and laugh. The other elves also chuckled. Trish, tell me in detail, what does that man look like? Blanche's expression turned serious as a figure appeared in her mind. He's very good looking. Even better than that, Prudence. Little one, are you seeing things? How can a human's appearance compare to Prudence's? One of the elves laughed. Even among the elves, Prudence was a famous handsome man. He couldn't believe that a human could surpass Prudence in terms of appearance. When I first saw him, I thought he was just average, but the more I look at him, the more I think Trish stomped her feet anxiously. She had a lot to say, but she didn't know how to say it. Anyway, he's better looking than Prudence. There's something about him that I can't describe. You mean his temperament? An elf asked. Yes, it's his temperament. Trish was overjoyed. She looked at the elf gratefully and said, He made me feel warm and hot. I didn't dare to look at him after that. Haha. I'm curious. A human can charm our little princess. I really want to see him with my own eyes. The elves looked at each other and laughed. What are you talking about? Trish asked, confused. Blanche didn't laugh. She asked nervously, What color are his eyes? It's dark and very deep. When I look at you, it's like you're going to fall into it. Let's go right now. Blanche suddenly turned around and walked quickly to the depths of the camp. She wanted to gather all the elves. Blanche, what's wrong? The elves were surprised. Do you really believe these words? Do you know who he is? Blanche spoke very quickly. Who is he? Raphael, the lord of the Holy Crown City, Raphael. All of the elves were dumbstruck, and Trish was no exception. Her little mouth was wide open, and if it had been any wider, her chin would have probably fallen off, and her mischievous eyes wouldn't have been able to move. Heavens! She was aiming her bow at a super powerhouse, but that Raphael didn't seem to be as terrifying as the legends made him out to be. Raphael has his eyes on us? An elf said with a trembling voice. His next words were close to a scream. His next target is us? No, he's warning us kindly, Blanche said hurriedly. There's no time for that now. Go back and prepare. I'll find a chance to explain later. Asterisk, you're crazy. An elf stood up angrily. Lydia, what are you trying to do? You're trying to murder an elder of the United Senate. The goddess of nature will never forgive your crime. Behind that elf, 7 or 8 other elves stood up one after another, glaring at Lydia. The other elves' expressions were complicated. Some were shocked, some were indifferent, and some were sneering. However, none of them supported Lydia. Most of the elves who attended this meeting were the patriarchs of various clans. Lydia put forward an outrageous request at the meeting. She asked the patriarchs to imprison the patriarchs of various clans, seize all their power, and gather all the armies they could to Bite City. There was an eternal contradiction between tradition and reform. The longer a civilization lasted, the more inertia it would have and the harder it would be to accept new things. It was easy to understand. The Eastern and Western civilizations in the other world were a good example. If it weren't for the strong intervention of the Western civilization, which made the Eastern civilization feel threatened, would the Eastern civilization change itself? It was very difficult. To put it bluntly, if there was a time and space barrier that separated the Eastern and Western civilizations forever, the Western civilization would continue to move forward according to the established path. Everything that should be in the sky would be in the sky, and everything that should be in the sea would be in the sea. Everything that should be in the sky would be in the sky, and everything that should be in the sea would be in the sea. On the other hand, the Eastern civilization also had its own fixed path. The Emperor's grace was vast and mighty, and the Emperor's grace was vast and mighty. Development and destruction were repeated, forming a unique, terrifying, and lamentable cycle. Women would definitely continue to bind their feet, because that was a symbol of beauty. Men might have cut their braids, or they might not have. Under the omnipresent constraints of Confucianism on the outside and Dharma on the inside, it was difficult for the so-called sciences and humanities to find a place to survive. Confucius did not speak of strange forces or gods. Since ancient times they lacked the spirit to explore the strange, so they could not be considered enlightened. It might be thousands of years later than Western civilization before people could play with computers, and this possibility was very limited. The elves also had their own traditions. The Senate represented the will of the goddess of nature. The patriarchs were in charge of the daily affairs, and the Senate decided the direction of the elves. They were used to obeying. Now that they suddenly heard that all the patriarchs were going to be imprisoned, even though the patriarchs knew that this would bring them great benefits, they still felt uncomfortable and even angry. "Sit down and talk," Lydia said with a smile. "I have nothing more to say to you." The elf patriarch coldly snorted and turned to walk out. Lydia sighed and reached out her hand. The elf beside her placed a longbow in Lydia's hand. The patriarch who was walking out was on high alert. He suddenly turned around and pulled the bowstring. The black arrow was aimed at Lydia's forehead. He shouted angrily, "Lydia, what are you trying to do?" "I'm trying to kill you," Lydia said as she pulled the bowstring nonchalantly. However, she only pulled the bowstring. There was no arrow on the bowstring. The patriarch saw that Lydia didn't care about what she said. He knew that this was not going to end well. He clenched his teeth and released the bowstring. With a sharp whistle, the black arrow left a blurry afterimage in the air as it flew towards Lydia's forehead. Lydia released the bowstring at the same time. As the bowstring bounced, a slight tearing sound came from the air. The patriarch froze. A thin line of blood appeared on the left side of his forehead, slanted down between his eyebrows and his right cheek. Then, half of the patriarch's head suddenly flew into the air, spraying a rain of blood. At this moment, the elves could clearly see that the smooth wound was piled with many smooth muscles, bones, and various organs. The elf patriarch's body swayed, and his remaining eye was still staring at Lydia. Then, he slowly fell to the ground. The arrow he shot was cut in half by an invisible force. Half of the arrow hit the tree trunk, while the other half grazed Lydia's right rib and hit the back of the chair. If the arrow had been an inch off its target, it would have hurt Lydia. "Don't forget, my name is Lydia." Lydia didn't seem to notice the danger just now. She glanced at the patriarchs who were still standing there. Who else? The dozens of clan leaders present were speechless. They were not frightened by Lydia's strength, but by her action itself. She wanted to kill a clan leader just because of a disagreement? Even the Senate didn't have this kind of power. Lydia slowly drew her bow again, but she didn't aim. Instead, she said calmly, "If you don't have any objections, sit down and talk." "Lydia, what are you doing?" An elven patriarch smiled bitterly. He supported Lydia, and that was why he dared to speak. "He will be killed by the orcs sooner or later. Instead of being humiliated, I might as well give him a quick death now." Suddenly, Lydia raised her hand. Another tearing sound was heard. The elf patriarch instinctively raised his arm to protect himself, but he couldn't resist the invisible force. Half of his arm and his neck were neatly severed. The elf patriarch wriggled in a daze. His head separated from his neck and fell to the ground, followed by his body. This time, the patriarchs were in an uproar. A dozen patriarchs who were watching the show jumped up and aimed their longbows at Lydia from all angles. "Sit down and talk," Lydia said calmly. Her fingertips slowly drew the bowstring again, ignoring all the threats in front of her. Some of the weaker elves had their cheeks twitching. Lydia's attitude was clear. "You either obey me or I'll kill you." But even if they could kill Lydia, how many of them could make it out alive? Magic Arrow Lydia was one of the few elves who had mastered all kinds of magic. Until now, she hadn't released any magic arrows that could cause mass destruction. "Everyone, calm down." One of the elves couldn't take the pressure anymore and yelled. Then, he turned to Lydia and said, "Lydia, you said he's going to be killed by the orcs? What's going on?" To show his sincerity, he sat down as he spoke. Lydia frowned as if she was thinking about what to say. She slowly let go of the bowstring. "Everyone, sit down, sit down." The first elf to sit down let out a sigh of relief. He quickly said, "Even if everyone is against Lydia's decision, shouldn't we at least know why Lydia wants us to do this?" He didn't need to say anything. The other elves saw Lydia let go of the bowstring and sat down one by one. Even the ones who were standing did the same. They didn't want to agitate Lydia further. They weren't afraid of killing. The problem was, there had to be a reason to kill or be killed. "The orcs are going to launch a large-scale attack on us. That's impossible," one of the elven patriarchs exclaimed. Lydia turned her head and looked at the elven patriarch. The elven patriarch was smart enough to keep his mouth shut. Just now, all the elves stood up. Even if Lydia attacked, she wouldn't necessarily choose him. Now that he was the only one who spoke, the result was obvious. "What's the point of a lie that will be exposed soon?" Lydia said calmly. "Also, the weather is too strange. Earthquakes everywhere, drought in the southwest, and snow in the northeast. I'm sitting at home writing, and I can't help but shiver in my coat. My fingers are frozen, and I can't even straighten them. Is 2012 real or what? Alright, sirs, it would be my fault if I asked you for tickets. Now, I don't care about tickets, I only want monthly tickets. Sirs, please be magnanimous and help me out. Don't make me worry." Chapter 366. No matter what kind of symbol the orcs had become, as an intelligent race, after countless years of baptism, they had cultivated their own fighting style. The first to attack were teams of elite orc warriors. They rode on gale wolves and brandished machetes and clubs. They broke out of the battle formation like sharp nails without any mercy. They charged directly at the elves who were caught off guard. They only had one goal: to penetrate the enemy's back. Following behind them were countless orcs with relatively simple equipment. Although they weren't very strong, they had a huge number of them. They were densely packed together and slowly but firmly pushed forward. They were unstoppable. There were countless thunderbirds hovering in the sky, and lightning constantly poured down, blasting the elven camp full of holes. The thunderbird's lightning was extremely fast, and every lightning bolt could easily hit an elf. As for the consequences, it all depended on the strength of the elf. This orc army was attacking the core of the elves, where the United Senate was located. The ones responsible for the defense here were Prudence's personal guards, the most elite Silver Pegasus Legion of the Emerald Tribe, and a large number of tree demons. The Beastmen's attack was met with strong resistance. The Gale Wolf warrior's attack was blocked by the Tree of Life. Countless vines stretched out and danced wildly, making it difficult for the Beastmen to move forward. Even if a small team could forcefully destroy the vines and break through the tree demon's blockade, they would immediately be surrounded by thousands of Silver Pegasus warriors. There was also a large number of elves hiding behind the vines, shooting arrows after arrows. What the orcs could have was completely dependent on their status, and status was linked to strength. The weaker orc warriors had almost no armor to protect themselves. Even if they released the berserk state, they could not resist the attacks of the elves. In the first round of confrontation, the elves' losses were very small. Most of them were killed by the Thunderbirds, but thousands of orc warriors had already fallen in a pool of blood. But the orcs were not afraid. They rushed forward, and just as the battle gradually became white-hot, a few huge black shadows flew over from afar, and a strong dragon's aura instantly shrouded the whole battlefield. Dragon City had sent out more than 20 giant dragons to support the elves. After Maxwell was killed, Dragon City withdrew most of the giant dragons, but there were still 5 or 6 left. After receiving the warning that the elves were under attack, they had the obligation to protect the elves. The dragon appeared in the sky, and the situation of the battle immediately began to reverse. In this world, all living things were just a bunch of ants. Only by grasping power, a high-end power, could one be the true ruler. The flock of Thunderbirds began to panic. Only a few daring Thunderbirds took the initiative to attack the dragon, while most of them flew in all directions in panic. Dragons were a race that had reached a perfect balance between offense and defense. They had powerful magic resistance. If they could evolve into gold dragons, they would be able to ignore most magic. Only forbidden spells could harm them. As for black dragons, they were even more terrifying than gold dragons. They had unparalleled magic resistance. Even if they wandered within the range of forbidden spells, they would at most suffer some superficial wounds. It was reasonable to say that if thousands of Thunderbirds released lightning at the same time, the total attack power would be enough to kill a top powerhouse. But there were no absolutes in the world. The magic defense of the giant dragons made the power of lightning insignificant. Thousands of insignificant lightning bolts added together, and the attack power was still very limited. Although they did not care about the damage from the lightning, seeing the inferior demons attacking them so wantonly, it aroused the wrath of several giant dragons. One of the giant dragons quickly spread its wings and flew hundreds of meters away in the blink of an eye, approaching the provoking Thunderbirds. Then, a wave of fire that was hundreds of meters long shot out, sweeping across the sky with an unstoppable force, illuminating the dark night. More than 20 Thunderbirds did not even have the time to let out a cry before they turned into ashes that scattered in the air. The other giant dragons began to dive toward the ground. The formation of the orcs was too dense. Not only did they have no space to escape, but they also maximized the damage of the dragon's breath. Waves of dragon's breath swept through the orc crowd, sweeping out a blank area. Those who were hit by the dragon's breath, whether orc warriors or wind wolves, were turned into ashes in an instant, just like the Thunderbirds. Several giant dragons stopped diving and pulled themselves up into the air, letting out proud roars. At the same time, all the orcs seemed to have heard the command and all released their berserk state. They had to resist the influence of the dragon's aura. Otherwise, it would not take long for the entire battle formation to collapse. Several giant dragons circled half a circle. After a short rest, they had recovered the ability to release dragon's breath. Then, they began to dive for the second time. The elves who had been hiding in the protection of the Tree of Life began to gather together, ready to launch a counterattack. Dragon's breath bloomed again. The giant dragons flapped their wings and flew forward quickly while trying to maintain the dragon's breath. Suddenly, the giant dragon flying at the front felt a sense of danger. He involuntarily stopped the dragon's breath and looked forward. Then, with a roar, he flapped his wings desperately and shot diagonally into the air. The other 2 giant dragons heard the warning of their companions and followed suit. In the distance, a few giant gorilla-like monsters were rushing toward them. Their footsteps were so unscrupulous. Some orcs could not dodge in time and were trampled into meat paste. Seeing this scene, the orcs did not mourn for their companions. Instead, they let out a deafening roar. The behemoth had finally appeared. This proved that their king was behind them. The charging speed of the behemoth was extremely fast. Every step they took could cover more than 20 meters. In the blink of an eye, they were close to the center of the battle formation. Then, like cannonballs, they shot into the air and pounced on the giant dragons. However, the giant dragons had wings, so they had the upper hand in terms of movement space. The other two giant dragons had already escaped the attack range of the behemoth. Only one of the giant dragons was a little slower. The behemoth scratched its abdomen, and blood immediately poured out like a torrential downpour. The giant dragon howled in pain, and its body couldn't help but roll a few times in the air. However, it quickly regained its balance and desperately rose to the sky. Most of the behemoth missed. Their bodies drew a long trajectory and smashed into the vines of the tree of life. In an instant they were tightly wrapped by the vines. Living vines could trap the orcs. However, it was almost impossible to trap the behemoth, which was known as the king of the land. A few behemoths swung their bodies casually and the countless vines were forcibly torn apart. With a gentle wave of their claws, the tough treants that gave the orc warriors a headache were easily torn into pieces. Then, the behemoth rushed toward the elves who had just finished gathering. Every behemoth was wearing a red eye patch. It looked particularly ferocious. The eyes were the only flaw of the behemoth. There were many strong archers among the elves. It was not difficult to shoot the behemoth's eyes. Although the arrows were pitifully small compared to the eyes of the behemoth, no matter what kind of creature it would always be uncomfortable to have a thorn in the eye. It could even cause blindness. The defensive line that the elves relied on to protect themselves collapsed under the attack of the behemoth. The Silver Pegasus Legion of the Emerald Tribe was also in chaos. They did not need to wait for orders. They would not listen to anyone's orders. The elves controlled the Silver Pegasus and rushed to escape into the distance. Everyone knew the fighting power of the behemoth. Not to mention that there were so many behemoths, just 2 or 3 of them could turn their entire legion into pieces of flesh. This was an irresistible force. The 3 giant dragon heads on top of their heads flew into the distance without looking back. Their pride, dignity, and so on had become meaningless at this moment. Only their own lives were worth cherishing. Although the dragons had the upper hand in the battle between the dragons and the behemoths, this was only relative to the superior dragons. The green dragons were still unable to release magic, and their main method of attack was to breathe dragon breath. Their dragon breath could burn the behemoths, and the behemoths could also attack them. If they continued to fight, it would undoubtedly mean death. The orc warriors let out an earth-shattering roar as they rushed into the hole that the behemoth had made. The large flock of thunderbirds also regained their courage as they flew all over the sky, chasing after the fleeing elves. With the addition of the behemoth, the situation of the battle was once again reversed. Han Jin quietly appeared in the battle formation of the orcs. He did not care about the powerful behemoth, but the large group of thunderbirds flying above his head gave him a headache. As the saying goes, everything has its vanquisher. His 3 true fire could cause fatal damage to the behemoth with poor magic defense, and the lightning launched by the Thunderbird group was also a threat to him. Therefore, Han Jin's first choice was to find the shamans. At this moment, Han Jin did not realize how painful his decision would be for Forza. There were hundreds of ignorant shamans standing around him. Forza also did not realize that the trouble that once caused Zagund, Alquite, and other strong men had come to him. Han Jin could sneak into any area, kill, and then retreat calmly. However, Han Jin's enemies could not do that. Even if Forza was strong, he could not sneak into the Holy Crown City alone. Forza had made a plan for the future. He was ready to form an alliance with the Holy Crown City first. He also believed that the Holy Crown City, which had been facing a great threat, would be happy to form an alliance with him. After the elves were eliminated, it would not be too late to deal with the Holy Crown City. Human? A shaman saw Han Jin and could not help but exclaim. Han Jin flipped his wrist, and a budding red lotus appeared in his hand. Tens of thousands of rays of light appeared out of nowhere and soared into the sky. Then, Han Jin said in a tone that sounded like a sigh, "Red Lotus, bloom." With Han Jin's chanting, the red lotus suddenly bloomed. Countless petals floated away and flew in all directions. And those petals kept splitting as they fluttered. One petal turned into two petals turned into four petals. In the blink of an eye, the area within a kilometer around Han Jin had become a world of flowers. Every single petal was emitting a dense multicolored light that was incomparably beautiful and beautiful to the extreme. They chased and danced about, causing one to be dazzled and lose one's mind. All the creatures who saw the petals, whether orc warriors or gale wolves, including the shamans, woke up from the state of excitement. At this moment, their souls became extraordinarily quiet. Then, an indescribable joy ignited in their hearts. What joy was there in life? What fear was there in death? At this moment, they had forgotten their past, present, and future. They just wanted to accept a kind of eternity with all of themselves. All the shamans stood there like wooden sticks. Some of them were giggling foolishly, while others kept turning their heads left and right, greedily admiring the shower of petals. Some even opened their arms as if they wanted to embrace something. However, their bodies were not as happy as they imagined. Soon, wisps of smoke spread out from the shower of petals. As their bodies dissipated, the shamans could no longer stand. One by one, they fell to the ground. But before their bodies could touch the ground, they had completely turned into smoke and disappeared without a trace. Their entire lives did not even leave behind a single trace of their existence. Outside the range of the Red Lotus Hellfire, groups of Beastman warriors seemed to have received an unknown summons as they slowly and mechanically walked towards Petal Shower. They had extremely satisfied and blissful smiles on their faces. Even the large flock of thunderbirds, who had lost their mental control, began to descend after a brief moment of panic. However, they did not fly very far, at most a few dozen meters, before disappearing one after another. Suddenly, a deafening roar came from afar. Many of the orc warriors who were in a state of infatuation woke up from a dream. They turned around and saw their companions mysteriously disappear in the dancing petals. They could not help but retreat in horror. Unfortunately, that roar could only stop the orc warriors from flying into the flames like moths to a flame. It could not reduce the power of the Red Lotus. Hundreds of shamans and nearly 1,000 orc warriors had completely turned into dust in this world. No matter how beautiful a magic spell was, it would eventually dissipate. The colorful glow on the petals dimmed and disappeared into the wind. Within a radius of nearly 1,000 meters, only Han Jin was left standing there alone. The shamans in this orc army had been rewritten to zero. Nearly half of the circling thunderbirds had also disappeared. They spread their wings and let out dazed cries before flying off into the distance. This was because this was not their battle. Han Jin suddenly took a step forward and walked forward. The orc warriors in front of him could not help but take a step back. When Han Jin took a second step, the orc warriors had already taken 5 or 6 steps back. The rear half of the battle formation showed signs of collapsing. No matter how much berserk transformation they unleashed, they could not resist the fear that rose from the bottom of their hearts. A orc leader stepped out from the crowd, holding a shiny scimitar tightly in his hand. He slowly approached Han Jin. His steps were very careful and even tentative as he walked forward. His eyes were locked onto Han Jin. "Who are you?" the orc leader said word by word. Han Jin frowned and glanced sideways to the east. Without saying anything, his figure quickly disappeared into the ground. The orc leader took a deep breath. He finally understood who the enemy was. Burrowing into the ground had become Han Jin's signature move. When Julia finally arrived at the elven camp in Wild Willow City and saw Lydia, she had just passed on Han Jin's message to Lydia. The orcs had already launched their attack. Forza completely turned hostile too quickly. Although Gao Bin was already vigilant, he did not have time to prepare accordingly. He did not even have time to go to Great Elder Amter for the last time. He could already see the ugly and excited faces of the orcs. Lydia couldn't find Gao Bin, but she was also a commander who had experienced hundreds of battles. At least she could immediately realize the current situation. Unlike the other elves who were tenaciously resisting, the First Order, she, who had always been known as crazy, was actually in order to retreat. However, Lydia had been excluded from the center of power for a long time. The elves of Wild Willow City had their own commanders, and the commanders refused to obey Lydia's orders. But now, Lydia was no longer alone. She invited all the tribal leaders for a meeting, but it was only halfway through. She had just forcibly suppressed the emotions of the tribal leaders when Julia arrived at the camp. She knew that Julia had been staying with Hanjin, so she had to see her no matter what. As a result, when she figured out Julia's intentions, the war had already broken out. Therefore, all the chiefs stood firmly on Lydia's side. Those who were against Lydia before had a 180-degree change in attitude. If they were given a chance to capture the elders of their own tribes, they wouldn't hesitate anymore. However, the war had already broken out. They couldn't return to their own camps, and could only stay here. Lydia, who had seen through the evil intentions of the orcs, had undoubtedly become their savior in their hearts. With the help of the tribal leaders, Lydia easily deprived the senior commanders of their power and killed a few of them herself. The rest were all imprisoned. Although the experience of the commanders was very precious in this war-torn era, Lydia did not care much about it. If she wanted to change her fate, all the elves must unite under the same banner. Those who were dissatisfied and opposed would only become the root of the elves' disaster. Lydia only left a small number of elves to try their best to stop the attack of the orcs. The rest of the elves left the camp and moved in the opposite direction. Unfortunately, what Forza wanted was to annihilate the elves' strength, not the gains and losses of a city. Forza divided all the orcs into 3 teams. One team destroyed the command center of the elves, and the other 2 teams besieged 2 relatively powerful elven tribes. Wild Willow City was one of them. Lydia and her team had only made it a dozen miles away when hundreds of 1,000-pound boulders came whistling towards them. All the elves gasped. They tried their best to dodge the boulders with the speed of their silver pegasi, but the boulders were shaped in a regular pattern. They rolled left and right after they hit the ground, and every time they rolled, several elves would be squashed into a puddle of blood and flesh. I didn't expect to cause such a big controversy. I feel that even if we argue for a few years, we won't get any result. Forget it. Actually, the main point I'm talking about is a kind of reincarnation. For a very long time, I couldn't understand why this nation that was plagued with disasters would always choose an extremely extreme method that was close to self-destruction in order to be reborn. Every time there was a change of dynasty, it was a cycle of destruction. Countless people would use up all their blood, and there would be very little social resources left. Then, they would develop again and be destroyed again. As for technology, I want to ask, since ancient times, where did the best talents of China gather? Of course, it's to become an official, because being an official is the most profitable job. These people don't have the energy to do anything else. They spend their lives scheming and working hard. What they think about is how to become an official, how to become a successful official, how to become an official with more and more achievement. Don't you think it's a waste of talent? Also, what I want to say is that we can go higher and further. We can be stronger and better. Why can't we do it? The 4 great inventions are great, but I hope that everyone can see other things as well. For example, Nobel's selflessness, Edison's diligence, Einstein's wisdom, Watt's hard work, Bruno's tenacity, and so on. I saw someone say, "Why do young people nowadays worship foreign things?" Well, since you said that I'm a young person, then I'll call you uncle. This is a bad habit of yours. Really, really bad. For thousands of years, many people liked to wave the moral stick around, putting a label or a hat on people, and then smashing them with the stick. I think there are 2 reasons for this. First, it's easy to save energy and you can defeat your opponent without any argument. Second, it's to establish your own noble and imposing image. However, this habit is very bad. Let me give you a sentence that seems to have appeared in Qianlong's era. I don't agree with every word you say, but I swear to defend your right to speak. Let me add that the person who said those words should be Voltaire. If this person was placed in any dynasty in China, he wouldn't have lived for long, and his entire family would have been exterminated. However, he was able to become the teacher of many European kings and was widely respected. This was the difference between cultures. Forget it. This question is meaningless. The inertia of culture is very strong. I don't want to be a praying mantis blocking a car, and I don't have the qualifications. I just want to live well. So, I won't respond anymore. I won't read the book reviews these days. Chapter 367. A chill ran down Lydia's spine. She knew very well that the remaining elves and the dryads who had lost their powerful long-range support would not be able to stop the orcs. It was only a matter of time before they were defeated. If they couldn't fight their way out, the orcs behind them would take over the camp and surround them. Not a single elf would be able to escape. Shrill horns sounded from the front. Dozens of orc warriors riding on gale wolves appeared on the flanks. They were not in a hurry to attack. When the elves desperately tried to push forward and kill their way out, the orc warriors ruthlessly stabbed their swords from the sides and completely tore apart the elves' battle formation. Lydia knew what the orcs were trying to do, but she had no choice but to move forward. To her, time meant the lives of countless elves. The other elves couldn't help but slow down their silver pegasi. Lydia was the only one who dashed out of the elven formation. She shot forward like a bolt of lightning with her longbow fully drawn. When she was less than 500 meters away from the hill giants, she finally released a dark red arrow. Following an intense magical fluctuation, a spark lit up on the rapidly flying arrow. Soon after, it turned into a small fire dragon that was 20 meters long. It roared, bared its fangs, and pounced towards the group of mountain giants. The hill giants were stunned when they saw that the elves could use magic. Then, a hill giant swung his heavy flail and rushed down from the top of the mountain. The flail swung from bottom to top, smashing towards the fire dragon that was much larger than him. With a loud boom, the fire dragon exploded. Countless tongues of fire swept out in all directions, instantly engulfing the hill giant's body. The withered grass, tree trunks, and shrubs within a radius of dozens of meters were all set ablaze by the tongues of fire. A powerful shockwave surged up the hillside. The dozen or so hill giants on the hillside seemed to have been hit by an unknown force. One by one, they were sent flying and fell in all directions. However, their injuries were not serious, and they quickly got up. The elven warriors followed Lydia and rushed forward. Countless arrows were shot out from the ground like birds flying into the forest. All of them were focused on the hill giant. There was a loophole in the orc army's formation. They thought that the elves would definitely fight to the death against their attack. If they couldn't hold on, they would order their army to retreat. Therefore, they placed the mountain giants and wolf riders on the second line of defense. They were responsible for killing the strong elves and the small elven army. Then, they placed the normal orc warriors on the third line of defense to surround and annihilate the remaining elves. Forza knew that after this battle, the orcs and elves would become mortal enemies. If he let a large number of elves escape, he would face a long period of revenge. The elves were very persistent in this regard. Therefore, his goal was very clear. He couldn't let a single one of them go. However, Lydia didn't want to resist the sudden attack of the orcs at all. She just wanted to preserve her strength. The strength of Wild Willow City was not weak. Plus, there were dozens of chieftains who couldn't return to their tribes. The hill giants and the wolf riders were facing the most powerful elven army. There were hundreds of ranger-level archers and even a dozen god-level archers. The orcs who felt that victory was in sight might be qualified to look down on the elves, but they couldn't underestimate the elves' all-out attack. The hill giants retreated, as if they had been electrocuted in the rain of arrows. Tens of thousands of elves released their attacks one after another. The arrows were so dense that any parrying or dodging became meaningless. Many hill giants hurriedly raised rocks to block in front of them, but they couldn't block the arrows below. The archer's combat skill was to use the strong tension of the bow to send the arrows far away. It could be said that each arrow contained a lot of power. When hundreds of arrows hit the same rock, the hill giants couldn't control their bodies and staggered back. Not to mention, for the ranger-level elves, the rocks weren't that hard. The arrows they shot could easily pierce the rocks and even penetrate the rocks, causing damage to the hill giant. If there was another round of arrows, the rocks would collapse. There were over 100 hill giants on both sides of the mountains, but after the first wave of attacks from the elves, more than 30 hill giants were lying in pools of blood. Some of them were wailing in pain, while others had already stopped breathing. The remaining hill giants saw that the situation was not good, so they immediately covered their heads and ran desperately to the back of the mountain. Lydia didn't have time to chase after the hill giant. The ominous feeling in her heart was getting stronger and stronger. She sent out 2 silver Pegasus companies to protect the flanks to contain the Wolf Knight on both sides. She commanded the army to quickly pass through the hills and continue moving forward. After another 10 miles or so, Lydia saw a dark mass of figures in front of her. She roughly estimated that there were about 60 to 70,000 of them. Countless orcs were running quickly towards the elves. Obviously, the orcs had received the warning and adjusted their deployment. The orc warriors were well equipped. Almost every orc was holding a steel weapon, and some even had a shield. Lydia felt a bitter taste in her mouth when she saw this scene. This was because the equipment was given to the orcs by the elves. When Han Jin went to the buried city, he didn't empty the armory of the Biteman cities. There was no need to. The elves had occupied the entire Biteman and naturally obtained all the equipment. However, they didn't have much use for them, so they gave them all to the orcs. Today, they finally tasted the consequences of nurturing a tiger. What made Lydia's heart turn cold was that with her excellent eyesight, she could clearly see that behind the orc army, there was a group of orc warriors riding on mammoths. Behind them were 2 behemoths that were dozens of meters tall. Even if Gao Bin was here, with the combined strength of the 2 of them, it would be difficult to protect the other elves from the charge of the behemoths. Lydia wasn't the only one who saw it. Almost all the elves in the front row could see the huge figure in the distance. An invisible wave spread among the elves. Many of them raised their heads and looked blankly at the sky. They hoped to see the figure of the dragon. Unfortunately, all they saw was the darkness that was getting darker and darker. Wait! Julia rushed over from the rear. She and Constance had been moving with the army. Lydia already understood Han Jin's intention, so of course she had to protect them. Lydia turned around. Her eyes were cold because she had made the decision to stake everything on this one throw. Raphael will come to help us, Julia said urgently. What? Raphael will come? Of course, Julia said in a firm tone. When we were attacked by the orcs, I had already sent out a magic signal. Lydia's eyes were complicated, but this was not the time for her to think. The wolf knights on both sides were slowly approaching, wandering outside the elves' shooting range. It was obvious that they were looking for an opportunity. The orc warriors at the front raised their shields and swung their longswords. They surged forward like a tidal wave, allowing the orcs to close in. The elves who were not good at fighting were about to be slaughtered. The elves at the front drew their longbows and shot arrows at the incoming orcs. The elves at the back pointed their arrows at the sky and launched projectiles. However, the orcs were not afraid at all. They raised their shields high and shouted crazily. The speed of their charge became faster and faster. There were orcs who were shot and fell to the ground, but the other orcs did not even bother to look at them. They were trading their lives for distance. If it was in the past, This volley of arrows would have been able to inflict heavy casualties on the poorly equipped beastmen. But now, only high-grade archers could easily kill the enemy. Most of the elves' lethality had been severely weakened. Fire dragons flew out from the elves' formation one after another, roaring as they shot at the orc warriors. Every time they exploded, hundreds of orcs around them would be turned into ashes. The powerful shockwaves that followed would sweep away the surviving orcs and orcs on the outside. The other great elves also unleashed their full power. Some arrows suddenly turned into hundreds of afterimages when they got close to their targets, turning a dozen or so orc warriors into honeycombs. Some arrows that hit their targets turned into countless vines and roots that wrapped around the orc warriors tightly. Those were Julia's dryad arrows. Some of the arrows had infinite penetrative power and could easily penetrate shield. Some of the arrows even pierced through a dozen orc warriors in one go before they ran out of energy. The hundreds of ranger archers were the real main force. They were the only ones who could deal effective damage to the orc warriors. But compared to the tens of thousands of orc warriors, they were still too weak. The distance between the two sides was getting closer and closer. 500 meters, 400 meters, 300 meters. Finally, the elves at the front could clearly see the ferocious and violent expressions on the orcs' faces. Beads of sweat appeared on Lydia's forehead and nose. Her mana wasn't limitless. Was there really no way to save them? Lydia's hand slowly reached for a small quiver that hadn't been used for more than 10 years. At this moment, a gray figure shot into the sky from the orc formation like a firework. Then, a loud roar echoed in the ears of every living being. Ha! Countless white lights were flung out from the figure. Every time a white light landed on the ground, it would turn into a 3 to 4 meter tall giant. The giant swung its rough but powerful arms and smashed the orc warriors in front of it. In an instant, more than 600 giants appeared on the battlefield. They lined up in a green battle line and forcefully stopped the orc warriors from attacking. The orc warriors weren't afraid of any challenge. They swung their long swords wildly and attacked the strange giants. Compared to the orc warriors, the giants' movements were sluggish and slow. They didn't know how to block or dodge the enemy's attack. In other words, they didn't care about those kinds of attack. The long swords left deep and shallow wounds on the giants' bodies. Some of the long swords were even stuck in their bodies. No matter how hard the orc warriors tried, they couldn't pull them out. But that didn't affect their fighting strength. Instead, they could smash the orc warriors into a bloody mess with a backhand punch. At most, the orc warriors didn't care about their lives, but the giants didn't care about life at all. Their fighting style was very simple and very wild. They pounced, smashed, and swept. That was all. However, they were like reefs that stood tall in the middle of a tsunami. They fought tirelessly and persisted. She suddenly felt relieved from the heaviness of death. This drastic change in emotions made Lydia want to cry. Her fingers trembled slightly. She let go of the quiver and pulled the bowstring. In a tearing sound, the head of an orc warrior that forced its way through the gap between the giants flew into the air. The headless body swayed a few times before it fell to the ground. The wooden army commander's charm released by Han Jin was worthless to the truly powerful. Even a small fireball released by a magician's apprentice could cause damage to the wooden soldiers, but to the orc warriors who were wielding their weapons, the wooden soldiers were powerful existences. Even if they lay still and allowed the orc warriors to chop off their legs or arms, it would still take at least 10 minutes for the orc warriors to chop off their legs or arms, but they would still be able to continue fighting. The wooden talismans were a derivative of the dryads. Their attack power was far weaker than the dryads, but their defense was on par with the dryads. Plus, the elves didn't expect the giants to defeat the enemy. They just needed time to unleash their attacks. Han Jin's body fell down. A fist force formed entirely by his divine will struck down like a thunderbolt. With a loud explosion, dozens of orc warriors were crushed into a pile of mud. Even their long swords and shields were twisted beyond recognition. A large crater was created in the ground. The orc warriors nearby felt the ground tremble violently. They couldn't control their bodies and fell to the ground. In the next moment, Han Jin's body disappeared into the crater. The orc warriors riding on the mammoths were horrified. They looked around for traces of Han Jin. The orc leader suddenly turned his gaze to the left. He didn't know when Han Jin had appeared there. He was casually holding a flaming longsword in his right hand. The tip of the sword was also casually dragged on the ground. With each step Han Jin took, the sword kept colliding with the ground, making crisp sounds. Fire Dragon Sword? The orc leader took a deep breath and asked word by word, "You are Raphael?" Han Jin didn't answer, but slowly walked forward step by step. He turned a blind eye to the two behemoths, who were baring their fangs at him. In the orc's battle system, the behemoth beasts were the trump card. When the behemoth beasts launched a group attack, they could easily decide the outcome of a battle. But everything in the world had a counter to each other. Was it worth it for him to care about an enemy that he could defeat with just a little 3 true fire? On the contrary, if there were hundreds of Thunderbirds wandering around, he wouldn't be able to maintain his current relaxed attitude. Why? The orc leader asked coldly. Han Jin smiled. He couldn't understand why the orc in front of him would ask such a question. Looking at the history of the orcs, it was full of barbarism, blood, and slaughter. They never created anything. They only used direct violence to take the achievements and resources of other races for themselves. They would wait until they had used up all that they had plundered before they went back to plunder again. Why? When they raised their butcher's knife, they never asked themselves why they were doing it. When they felt threatened, they felt that it was unfair. They had to ask why. And this made Han Jin's killing intent even more intense. "Because you all deserve to die," Han Jin said calmly. "I think we have a common enemy." The orc leader took a deep breath again. "You should attack those elves." "And then?" Han Jin smiled. "And then?" The orc leader was at a loss for words. He knew what Han Jin meant. "And then we can coexist peacefully. Wild Willow City and the Bite Man will belong to us. As for the rest, we can leave them to you." Interesting, very interesting. When have you ever coexisted peacefully with humans? We. That beast-man paused for a moment before revealing an angry expression. He coldly said, "Raphael, don't think that the beast-man race is afraid of you. It's only because you inexplicably attacked us that we feel regretful." "I don't feel regretful, not at all." Han Jin waved his fire dragon sword, his eyes full of mockery. "And I'm going to propose to Yelena." "What?" The orc leader didn't understand. What did proposing to Yelena have to do with Han Jin's deliberate provocation? "Kill all of you. This is the best gift I can give to Grand Duke Solomon." "In your dreams!" The orc leader shouted angrily. The two behemoths had been waiting impatiently for a long time. They rushed towards Han Jin from both sides. Han Jin was more than 50 meters away from them. For them, this was only a matter of 2 steps. Then, they waved their sharp claws and clawed at Han Jin from above. Han Jin's body flashed and disappeared from where he was. When he appeared 100 meters away, he quietly stared at the two behemoths. His eyes were even more cynical than before. What Solomon had taught him was not only the techniques of using his spiritual force to launch attacks, but also various methods of refining his spiritual force. In the past, Han Jin could only slowly cultivate his spiritual force by meditating, concentrating, and concealing his spirit. But now there was another way. The advantages of a stronger spiritual force were self-evident. At least, he could now release the ground shrinking spell very quickly. He could even release the ground shrinking spell after he had done something. The two behemoths looked around blankly and quickly found Han Jin's position. They rushed towards Han Jin one after another. Han Jin's body flashed and disappeared again. Then, he appeared in the distance with a leisurely look. This was no longer a battle, but a game. Even if there were thousands of behemoths here, As long as he had enough time, he could still kill all of them, let alone 2 behemoths. Fire that fire! The orc leader let out a panicked cry. On the feet of the 2 behemoths, there were a few flames burning quietly. However, the behemoths, with their thick skin and thick flesh, didn't feel any pain. They didn't think that the star-like flames could cause any harm, but the orc leader knew. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 368. Sunir's arrow pierced through the back of the monster's head, causing blood to spurt out. She didn't think that she would be able to hit her target so easily, and couldn't help but be startled. The arrow that pierced through the monster's body didn't cause too much damage to it. That ugly, fleshy face slowly turned towards Sunir's direction without any hindrance. The tentacles hanging from its mouth stretched out and stabbed towards Sunir. The monster's movements seemed slow, but the tentacles were as fast as lightning. By the time Sunir reacted, the tentacles were only a few meters away from her. Sunir didn't have time to react, so she stomped on the ground and leapt backwards. However, the tentacles didn't slow down in the slightest, and in the blink of an eye, they caught up with Sunir's retreating figure. At this critical moment, Sunir abruptly curled up her entire body, and the tentacles brushed past her scalp and soles. Before Sunir could even breathe a sigh of relief, the tentacles actually twisted around and wrapped around her body while she was still in the air. Sunir was startled and began to struggle with all her might, but the tentacles were strangely strong. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't break free. Furthermore, the more she struggled, the tighter the tentacles became. In the end, Sunir couldn't even breathe properly, so she reluctantly gave up. Sunir's left hand that was holding the bow was tightly tied to her body. Her right hand that was holding the arrow and forearm could still move, but the range of movement was pitifully small. It was easy to imagine how much strength she could use. Furthermore, the distance was too far. Even if she used all her strength to throw the arrow, it wouldn't have any effect. The tentacles dragged Sunir's body in the direction of the monster. Although the ground was very soft and there weren't any craggy rocks, Sunir's body was still inevitably left with scars and her clothes were tattered. Seeing that she was getting closer and closer to that malevolent face, it was impossible to say that Sunir wasn't afraid. However, after so many years of tempering, Sunir's nerves had been tempered to be incomparably tough. Even in this life-and-death situation, she still didn't give up on counterattacking. With a flick of her wrist, the arrow in her hand was shot towards the face with incomparable speed. Sunir's timing was very good. At this distance, she was able to display the strength of the arrow. Although it couldn't be compared to an arrow shot from a bow, if it was an ordinary magical beast, this attack would be enough to kill it. Unfortunately, because Sunir's body was being dragged, she didn't have a good grasp of the direction of the arrow. This caused the arrow to miss the ground and hit the bottom of the face. Sunir couldn't help but close her eyes in pain. The arrow that she shot with all her strength didn't even cause any effective damage to the monster. This arrow that missed its target was even less likely to have any effect. There's only one way left, Sunir thought with some regret. She really couldn't bear to part with it. At this time, below the face, there was a sudden roar from the pitch-black hole. Sunir was surprised to see that the face's facial features were all wrinkled up in pain. She couldn't help but be surprised. What's going on? The answer was soon revealed. As the fleshy face slowly rose, an even bigger face appeared in front of Sunir. In comparison, the previous fleshy face looked more like a sarcoma, which made it look somewhat funny. However, Sunir didn't feel funny at all. She finally understood why the arrow that she shot with all her strength didn't have any effect even though it pierced through the monster's head. It turned out that the monster was only using it to confuse the enemy. Thinking of this, Sunir felt a chill in her heart. Is this the intelligence that a magical beast should have? Finally, the monster's entire body was exposed from the ground. That huge face was covered with crisscrossing veins. Sunir's arrow was stuck right above the face. Along the wound there was still a black liquid flowing out. Supporting the face was an incomparably thick pillar of flesh. The lower end of the root was still in the hole. She couldn't tell how long it was. The monster opened its mouth. Suddenly, a fishy stench assaulted her face, almost suffocating Sunir. But immediately, Sunir couldn't care less about her disgust because the tentacles suddenly tightened and suspended her in the air. Then, under the control of the tentacles, Sunir's body was slowly brought to the monster's open mouth. The distance was so close that Sunir could clearly see the squirming flesh in the monster's mouth. If Sunir's right hand was tied up, then there was only one outcome. She would undoubtedly become the monster's tonic. Fortunately, she could still move her right hand. Sunir's fingers moved and a fiery red talisman appeared in her hand. As long as there was a glimmer of hope, Sunir would never use it. This small talisman carried too much of her thoughts. However, the situation in front of her didn't allow Sunir to think too much. She forcefully suppressed the reluctance in her heart. According to the method taught by Han Jin, Sunir swung her hand and threw out the talisman. The fiery red talisman shot straight into the monster's open mouth. The next moment, a dazzling red light exploded, followed by the sound of the monster's heart-wrenching roar. True Flame Mantra. It gathered the power of dozens of 3 true flame talismans together to produce a superimposed explosive killing power. The disadvantage was that the speed was also slow. If the 3 true flame mantra was effective, then using the true flame mantra would be a waste. Han Jin had always been saving his energy. If the opponent could avoid the 3 true flame mantra, then they could also avoid the true flame mantra. Therefore, Han Jin had never used the true flame mantra. The reason he gave this talisman to Sunir was because Sunir's decision was too sudden. He didn't have the time to make other talismans. Ordinary 3 true flame mantra couldn't express how much he cherished it. At the same time, the tentacles wrapped around Sunir's body suddenly lost their strength. Sunir suddenly felt her body loosen, and her whole body fell to the ground. Sunir wanted to stretch out her hand to support herself on the ground, but she found that the tentacles were still attached to her body. She couldn't make any big movements, and could only let her body fall heavily to the ground. Ignoring the pain on her body, Sunir tried hard to turn her head to look in the direction of the monster. She was delighted to find that half of the monster's head had disappeared. The remaining part was like a broken bowl full of rotten meat. It was supported by a column of meat that was teetering on the verge of collapse. On top of it, there were flames quietly burning everywhere. The 3 true flame mantra could burn under any conditions, but the facts proved once again that there was nothing absolute in this world. In the rotten meat of the monster, there was a thick black liquid that exuded a rotten smell. Amidst the creaking sounds that made one's scalp tingle, the flames were extinguished one after another. Even a dragon wouldn't be able to withstand such a heavy injury. However, in this training illusion, it seemed that unimaginable things would always happen. The monster that had lost half of its head still didn't seem to be completely dead. Its exposed black and red muscles were still squirming as the black liquid spurted out. Sunir stared at the monster's broken head as she struggled to break free from the tentacles that were wrapped around her body. God knows what other attacks this monster had. It was better to leave this place as soon as possible. The column of meat that supported the monster's head suddenly shook, and then Sunir saw the column of meat begin to tilt towards her. Before she could react, the monster's broken head fell down and covered Sunir. This feeling was really cruel. It wasn't that Sunir couldn't react in time, but those damn tentacles were restricting her movements. She couldn't dodge at all, and could only watch this scene unfold before her eyes. After the monster covered Sunir with its head, it began to shrink, and easily covered Sunir's entire body. The closed monster's head looked like a flower bud, and then this flower bud was pulled into the hole by the column of meat. Without any light, Sunir's vision was pitch black. Her hands were wet and slippery, and it was indescribably disgusting. However, this wasn't what Sunir was most worried about. Sunir was worried that her consciousness was starting to become dizzy, and the strength in her body was slowly fading away. Am I going to die just like this? Sunir thought unwillingly. Before she fell into a coma, she only had time to recall that lonely and stubborn figure before she lost all consciousness. In the limited mind of the monster, at this moment it was filled with anger. Due to the fact that it couldn't move freely, it had always regarded flying monsters as its number one enemy, such as the white tigers. It had never thought that this slender and weak creature would cause such serious damage to it. Therefore, it decided that it must digest this fellow who dared to injure it, and not luxuriously drink the juices of its prey like before. In fact, with its current condition, it couldn't hunt on the ground anymore. It was originally just an ordinary 7-colored datura flower, and like the other flowers in the valley, it was baptized by the breeze and the sun every day. It worked hard to grow, and it worked hard to plant its roots deep into the soil that it relied on to survive. Until one day, it suddenly felt that it wasn't just absorbing nutrients from its roots, but something else that it couldn't understand. That day was very important to it because it had gained a sense of sensation. Sensation was a very mysterious thing, and to a certain extent, having a sense of sensation was equivalent to having the entire world. It was hard to imagine how a lifeless stone could exist, and you couldn't expect the ground under your feet to suddenly smile at you. Compared to the other 7-colored datura flowers, it could be said to be incomparably lucky. At that moment it truly felt the beauty of the sun, the gentle caress of the breeze, and the moist air that made it intoxicated. I want to have this forever, at that moment it said to itself. Although it couldn't be compared with the tigers in terms of intelligence, it couldn't change its obsession with this matter. So it began to desperately absorb that mysterious power, although it didn't understand what it was. It only knew that without that power, everything it had now might leave it. Gradually, with the passage of time, it grew taller and taller, and its strong roots also became deeper and deeper in the soil, and the range became wider and wider. Soon, the small piece of land under its body could no longer meet its need. And what made it distressed was that the mysterious power didn't seem to be endless. As its needs grew bigger and bigger, the power that could be absorbed became thinner and thinner. Later, it didn't dare to absorb without scruples, for fear that the mysterious power would disappear. Until one day, when one of its roots inadvertently entangled with the root of a datura flower beside it, it was surprised to find that the thing from the root was so familiar, and like the mysterious power, it could make it grow stronger. This discovery made it tremble with excitement, so it inevitably extended its roots to all the datura flowers that grew around it, although not long ago they were the same species. Day after day of devouring, as it grew taller and taller, its body also quietly changed. However, it did not care about any of this. There was only one thought in its simple mind, and that was to absorb all the energy it could absorb. Finally, it sadly found that the mandala flowers around it had been completely devoured by it, and its roots couldn't reach any further. So it turned its attention to the nearby demonic beast. At this time, its roots could already make some movement. After it successfully absorbed the energy of a rabbit-like demonic beast, it launched an unstoppable attack on all the demonic beasts that passed by it. But good times didn't last long. When it fearlessly reached out its tentacles to a white tiger, it was almost smashed to pieces by the sound waves emitted by the tiger. Only then did it understand that it was not the master of this world. So it began to work hard to find a way to protect itself. The bottomless hole, the black fog, and the sarcoma on its head were all created by it over a long period of time. But it didn't waste its efforts, at least it succeeded in surviving until now. In the future, Only God knew what this datura flower would become. However, the appearance of Sunir interrupted its evolution. More than half of its head was gone, and it didn't know how long it would take or how much energy it needed to absorb to return to its original form. To it, this was tantamount to a bolt from the blue. At this moment, its hatred for Sunir had risen to an unprecedented level, but it still controlled itself and slowly absorbed the energy in Sunir's body. It didn't want to waste even a drop of energy. Of course, even if it sucked Sunir dry, it wouldn't be able to return to its previous strength. So at the same time, it was still absorbing the mysterious energy that it didn't want to use for a long time. Sunir's coma was mostly due to the lack of air. If this situation continued, then even if the monster didn't do anything to her, she would still suffocate to death. Something strange happened. The mysterious power didn't nourish its body and make it grow as usual. Instead, it rushed toward Sunir, who was wrapped in layers of power, like a beast that had smelled blood. The monster didn't expect this to happen, but once something happened, it couldn't be stopped. It could only watch as the mysterious energy that originally belonged to it slowly flowed into Sunir's body through its veins. Sunir didn't know anything about what was happening around her. She just lay there quietly. The only difference was that, under the invasion of the mysterious energy, there were some small changes on her body. The hexagram mark between her eyebrows suddenly emitted a faint light. As if it had heard the summons, the mysterious power suddenly became turbulent and rushed toward Sunir crazily. The hexagram became brighter and brighter, and in the end it started to spin on its own. The moment it started to spin, everything changed. Not only was the mysterious force drawn to Sunir involuntarily, but the monster was also horrified to find that with the rotation of the six-pointed star, the little remaining power in its body was also being sucked into it. The two types of energy were continuously being sucked into the hexagram. Sunir was still unconscious and didn't have any reaction. Only the hexagram on her forehead was emitting a dazzling light. When the dazzling light reached its peak, there seemed to be a crisp sound coming from the location of the hexagram. It was as if something had been shattered. When the light dissipated, a brand new hexagram mark was left between Sunir's eyebrows. In the middle of the hexagram, there were a few faint lights slowly flowing. The monster that evolved from the devil's snare flower was now completely shriveled, as if all the water in its body had been sucked out. It was like a huge withered branch lying there, without any signs of life. Tens of meters under the monster's body, a black necklace was lying there quietly. On the necklace there was a skull pendant. From time to time, the eyes of the skull would flicker with a weak red light. Not long after, the red light became dimmer and dimmer until it disappeared. After a long time, Sunir slowly opened her eyes. Her surroundings were pitch black, and only a ray of sunlight leaked in from the hole above. Under the reflection of the light, she couldn't see the inside of the hole. Immediately, Sunir remembered the scene when she was wrapped up by the monster before she fainted. She subconsciously began to struggle. Following Sunir's movements, a crashing sound could be heard. Countless dried-up fragments fell to the ground. Sunir was surprised to find that she was no longer bound. However, Sunir didn't have time to think too much about it. She stomped on the ground and her whole body soared into the air, flying straight out of the hole. The scene outside was still a mess, and the blood flowing out from the white tigers' bodies hadn't dried up yet. It seemed that she hadn't been in a coma for too long. Thinking of this, Sunir ran away as fast as she could. Though she didn't know what had happened, she'd better stay as far away from the monster as possible. After running for a few steps, Sunir discovered that something was wrong. Her footsteps were obviously lighter than usual, and her body was full of energy. What was going on? What happened while she was unconscious? Sunir stopped a few hundred meters away from the hole. She was bewildered as she examined her body. Soon, Sunir found the source of the abnormality. From the middle of her eyebrows, where the hexagram was located, There was a warm current flowing through her body that could only be perceived if she used her heart to feel it. Moreover, there was something extra in her mind. It was a completely new ability that she had never come into contact with before. Sunir couldn't believe it. Was this real? Sunir carefully reached out her hand according to the image in her mind. A miracle happened. In the middle of her slender white palm, a small whirlpool appeared. The whirlpool slowly rotated, constantly emitting a gentle light. It was gorgeous but not dazzling. At the same time, the hexagram between Sunir's eyebrows emitted a weak light. However, Sunir was unable to see the changes between her eyebrows, so she didn't know anything about it. After pondering for a long time, Sunir found her bow. Fortunately, it wasn't damaged. She took out an arrow from her quiver and slowly pulled it back. Suddenly, an indescribable feeling of joy rose from the depths of her heart. This power, this unimaginable power, did it really belong to her? Sunir had the urge to look up to the sky and cry out. She forcefully controlled her emotions and focused all her attention on the arrow. Then, she gently released her fingers and the arrow shot out like lightning. In an instant, the arrow flew a few hundred meters away. In the distance that the arrow flew, everything became a blur. There was no fog blocking it, but everything was trembling at an extremely fast speed. A sharp whistling sound that could almost pierce through one's heart rang out. In a place where Sunir couldn't see, giant snakes fell from the trees one after another. They were writhing their bodies in pain. Some of the smaller monsters were even shaken to the point of fainting. Further away, there was a giant bear-like monster that was covering its ears with all its might. It was even using its head to hit a tree trunk and a rock. It was almost going crazy. Sunir also heard the whistling sound, but she didn't find it piercing at all. On the contrary, she felt very comfortable. The scene in front of her became more and more blurry. In the end, it completely exploded. The tall tree trunks were shattered into pieces at the same time. The tiger corpses that were caught in the attack also exploded into a rain of blood. An invisible force was forcefully dismembering them. A sandstorm rose from the ground. Everything that was swirling and flying in the storm was so fine that it couldn't be any finer. Even the sand couldn't escape being cut by that force. Sunir suddenly felt her vision turning black. Her body swayed a few times and she sat down on the ground. However, her eyes were still staring straight ahead. Was this really caused by her? After a while, a trace of joy bloomed on her face. She finally had the power. This meant that she also had the right to refuse. After resting for a few days, she would go somewhere else to look for the 7-colored datura flower. Then, she would be able to leave. Chapter 369. Raphael, thank you. Otherwise we... Julia couldn't finish her sentence. Her eyes were filled with tears. Why are you saying this? Han Jin smiled. I'm glad you're all right. Lydia was also here, along with dozens of elders and high-ranking commanders. When they heard Han Jin's words, they all felt ashamed. No matter what they did in the past, the elves were a race with a sense of shame. They started the war first, and in the end, it was the enemy they wanted to destroy that saved them. This was undoubtedly a resounding slap to their faces. Although they could tell that Han Jin said, I'm glad you're all right and not all of you, at this moment, what right did they have to question him? There were also some elders who had complicated expressions. It was Han Jin who deliberately instigated the conflict between the elves and the orcs, then turned around and became their savior. This feeling was indescribable, but they also knew that the orcs had already launched an attack on them. It was obvious that they already had a plan. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to act so quickly. Master Raphael, what do you think we should do? Lydia asked softly. If they had met Han Jin a few hours ago, and Lydia had used the same tone to ask Han Jin, all of the elves would have gone crazy. But now all of them felt that this was normal. Their eyes were focused on Han Jin, waiting for Han Jin's answer. This is your business, I can't say. Han Jin shook his head. The key is, what do you want to do? The orcs won't just attack us. I want to help our comrades, Lydia replied. From beginning to end, Lydia had never objected to the relationship between Han Jin and Sunir. She also didn't agree with attacking Han Jin, so her expression was very natural. I can understand. Master Raphael, can you? Lydia stopped mid-sentence. She felt that she couldn't say it out loud. I won't be able to help you in the short term. Han Jin knew what Lydia wanted to say. Most of the orcs have escaped. Forza should be able to judge that I will definitely be on your side. In order to avoid a front and back battle, he may temporarily change his target and attack the Holy Crown City first. You can retreat into the forest if you can't hold on. But we have no place to retreat. Can we retreat to Depew City? We will always remember what you have done for the elves. An elf chief suddenly stood up and said in an agitated tone. To be able to become a chief, they naturally had a certain level of intelligence. Even without Han Jin's words, they were able to understand Han Jin's hidden meaning. If Han Jin were to sit on top of the mountain and watch the tigers fight, then Forza would never provoke the Holy Crown City. He would only concentrate on annihilating the elves first. However, if Han Jin showed up to save the elves, it was tantamount to showing his hostility to the orcs. Forza was likely to change his plan, which was undoubtedly leading the danger to himself. What did it mean to repay evil with good? They saw the most perfect explanation in Han Jin. I am also doing it for myself. If you are destroyed by the orcs, the Holy Crown City will be in a very bad situation. Han Jin smiled. From now on, our fates are connected. Yes. The elf chief nodded vigorously. He knew all that Han Jin said, but Han Jin could speak frankly, which made him like Han Jin even more. What an upright young man. But, do you have a specific plan? Han Jin asked. Plan? Lydia showed a bitter smile. After we were attacked, we immediately organized a breakout, but then we encountered the orcs' ambush. How could we have time to prepare a plan? Han Jin sighed and turned his eyes to the distance. The elves were cleaning the battlefield, bandaging the wounds of their injured companions, and carrying the bodies of their companions together. Time was running out, and they had no time to let their companions return to the embrace of life, so they could only bury them hastily. Alas, if only Lord Gaobin was here. An elf chief sighed. Gaobin? Han Jin was stunned. He felt that the name was familiar, and soon remembered that he had seen something about Gaobin in Solomon's secret chamber. You don't know? Gaobin is Sunir's brother. Lydia whispered. Oh. Han Jin grinned. His smile was very relaxed, but his heart was still a little painful. Lord Raphael, I think, there is something we should tell you frankly. The elf chief, who had a good impression of Han Jin, said. They united with the Senate to form an alliance with the orcs, but it turned out that they were wrong. In the future, who would dare to believe them? According to the current trend, Gaobin was very likely to become the new leader. Gaobin was strongly against forcing Sunir to marry anyone, and from Lydia's words, they knew that Sunir only liked this human lord in front of them. In the end, it was this human lord who saved them. With these three reasons added together, he felt that it was time to reveal the truth. What is it? Han Jin asked. Cough, it's about Sunir. The elf chief looked around and the rest of the elves looked at each other, but no one spoke. Sunir? Oh right, where is she? Julia anxiously asked. She had always wanted to find Sunir and ask her about it, but as soon as she arrived at the camp, she was attacked by the orcs. She didn't have time to ask anything. Sunir. Lydia bitterly smiled. She entered the illusion of the temple a few months ago. Great Elder Amjala had sent people to look for Sunir several times, but there was no news. In the end, there seemed to be some changes in the illusion, and we couldn't open it from the outside. Then, will Sunir? No, Gaobin said that Sunir will be fine. How is that possible? Julia seemed to have woken up from a dream and shouted, "She entered the illusion of the temple a few months ago? That's not right. Isn't she married to Prudence?" At that time, great elder Amtula did have this intention, but how could the stubborn Sunir be willing to be manipulated? On the day Amtula talked to her, Sunir escaped into the illusion with the help of an elf and never appeared again. Lydia said, in order to boost everyone's morale, Amtula chose an elf who looked similar to Sunir and let her marry Prudence. "My lord, you..." Lydia couldn't continue. From the beginning until now, Han Jin's performance had been very good. His smile was warm, his tone was gentle, and he was very polite. There was no arrogance in his expression, and his answers were flawless. However, after listening to the conversation just now, Han Jin suddenly became a different person. Although he didn't make any movements, his eyes were shining with a bright golden light. Lydia felt like something was about to explode. "Prudence and Maxwell set a trap for Sunir to seduce me. That Sunir is..." Han Jin's tone also became very strange. He didn't sound like he was talking, but it was like he was squeezing out every word. "Of course it's fake. Why would Sunir harm you?" Lydia said. Han Jin became completely silent. At this moment, he had nothing to say. "You see, I told you, Sunir won't marry that Prudence." Julia was overjoyed. She reached out her hand and grabbed Han Jin's arm. Immediately, the joy on her face became stiff. Han Jin's arm became as stiff as steel and even trembled slightly. This was caused by his muscles being too tense. "Raphael, you..." Han Jin remained silent and looked at Julia quietly. However, Julia knew very well that Han Jin's focus wasn't on her. His unfocused eyes seemed to be looking through her, through the earth, and into nothingness. Julia asked worriedly, "Raphael, what's wrong with you?" When Cain was telling the story, he deliberately avoided mentioning the relationship between Han Jin and Yelena, so she didn't know anything. "I'm fine." The corner of Han Jin's mouth twitched a few times. Finally, he forced a smile that could be considered gentle. Sunir's betrayal had indeed hurt him, but it wasn't a problem. He wasn't a child, and he had enough self-recovery ability to find a way to free himself. "Didn't you betray me? It's okay, I don't hold a grudge against you. On the contrary, I will help the elves and provide protection for them. The more noble and selfless I act, the more it reflects your shallow ignorance." However, now that he knew the truth, Han Jin had been kicked down from the highest point of morality. Sunir didn't do anything, and everything was because of his gullibility. His heart didn't hurt anymore. Instead, it hurt a kind of bloody pain. "Raphael, you don't have to hide it from me. I can see that you must have something on your mind." Julia asked anxiously, "What's wrong?" "It's really nothing," Han Jin said softly, then slowly exhaled. "If only life was like the first time we met." "What are you talking about?" Julia hurriedly looked around. In the past, Han Jin always used spells that they didn't understand to release magic. She thought that there was an enemy. "I'm saying that if life was always as beautiful as the first time we met, it would definitely be a very happy thing." Han Jin smiled. "Spring is coming." As if to prove Han Jin's words, a twisted bolt of lightning flashed across the night sky, illuminating the world. Then, the sound of thunder rushed into their ears, causing them to buzz. Then, rain fell from the sky and sprinkled on their faces. The cool feeling was very comfortable. "You guys go. I'll stay here to buy time for you," Han Jin said calmly. "Okay, I won't argue with you anymore." Lydia stood up, but after taking a few steps, she turned around and said slowly, "But, thank you. You're too polite." Han Jin's gaze turned to Julia. "Where do you want to go? Come with me, or..." "I want to fight with my people," Julia said firmly, but she hesitated. "Then, Gibran? Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on him for you." Han Jin smiled. Julia couldn't help but feel embarrassed and angry. Although she didn't realize that Han Jin was deliberately changing the topic, This matter was very important to her. So, Han Jin's plan was ruined. You don't want to see Sunir? Why wouldn't I? Han Jin said slowly. But I have to go back. Let's talk about it when the situation gets better. After I find Sunir, I'll go to the Holy Crown City with her to find you, Julia said while observing Han Jin. Okay. Julia felt that something was wrong with Han Jin, but she couldn't tell what it was. After pondering for a while, the question in her heart finally turned into a few words. Take care. You have to take care too. Otherwise, Gibran will hate me for the rest of his life. Han Jin said half-jokingly. The elves moved quickly. They cleaned up the battlefield hastily, buried the bodies of their companions, and took care of the injured. Then, they all left the camp and went straight to the forest. They had come from the forest, and that was their world. Saving their companions and protecting themselves were equally important. Marching on the plains would easily be discovered by the beastmen. It was too dangerous. Although the forest could greatly slow down their speed, it could at least ensure their safety. Han Jin stood there quietly. The fine rain kept falling on his body and gradually wetted his robe, but Han Jin didn't feel it at all. After being influenced by Solomon, Han Jin's mind had become very tough, but he couldn't control the ups and downs of his heart. Was it right or wrong? It was undeniable that if he hadn't been together with Yelena, no matter how open-minded Solomon was, he wouldn't have passed on his most precious inheritance to Han Jin. Then, he wouldn't have been able to understand the truth of this world. If he focused on cultivation, his body would be indestructible. Yes, if he practiced hard, he would reach the state of indestructible one day. But so what? If he alarmed those powerful beings, he would still be killed. In the past, he even thought of hiding somewhere and secretly practicing. Now, he knew how naive that was. This world had its own rules. It was his great fortune to be able to hold Yelena's hand. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to go far. Even if his body was indestructible, he couldn't escape death. Therefore, he couldn't say that he was wrong. It was Yelena who changed his fate. It was Solomon who gave him a goal, and he didn't have time to repay anything. But if he wasn't wrong, who was wrong? Sunir? Sunir didn't do anything wrong. After a long time, the orcs still didn't appear, and the elves had already gone far away. Han Jin's figure began to move slowly, but the direction he chose was a bit strange. It was neither to return to the Holy Crown City, nor to chase after the elves, nor to find trouble with the orcs. Perhaps his soul was still not strong enough. In the pain of being pierced by needles, Han Jin instinctively chose to escape. Sometimes, Han Jin would walk a few steps, then release the ground shrinking spell to appear in the distance, then walk a few more steps. Sometimes he would walk more than 1,000 meters away, and sometimes he would release the ground shrinking spell again. He didn't have any direction. He just didn't want to stay where he was, nor did he want to calm down. He had to do something. The sky was slightly brighter, which meant that the bloody night had passed. But the sky was still gloomy, and the rain was getting heavier. Han Jin had released thousands of ground shrinking spells in the middle of the night. He had already walked out of the Bite Man and entered the territory of Black Raven City. His steps were no longer scattered, but now he was running. He rushed forward in the wind and rain, because the oncoming coldness could slightly relax his heavy heart. Black Raven City was still under the influence of the elves. They didn't know what had happened in the front line, so they patrolled as usual. Soon, they found a figure in the distance. They hurriedly sent out dozens of Silver Pegasus warriors, trying to stop him. But Han Jin unconsciously released several ground shrinking spells in succession, bypassing the elves and disappearing into the distance. It was said that spring rain was as precious as oil, but today's oil was too devalued. The raindrops were getting heavier and heavier, and the wind was getting stronger and stronger. Streaks of silver snakes shuttled back and forth in the dark sky, and thunder boomed one after another. Suddenly, A bolt of lightning fell from the sky and struck a towering ancient tree. The tree trunk that was as thick as several people hugging it was charred black and even emitted flames. However, the following rains soon extinguished the flames. The towering old tree was only 60 or 70 meters away from Han Jin. Han Jin's footsteps came to an abrupt halt. Although he had been in a state of absent-mindedness, he was still highly alert to danger. This bolt of lightning had completely awakened him from his daze. Han Jin found that his robe had become a tight suit. Water was dripping from the hem of his robe and the cuffs, and even his hair was soaked. He couldn't help but smile bitterly. Then he circulated his vital energy, and a thick cloud of water vapor rose from his body. Han Jin glanced around. He didn't want to hide underground. It was too depressing. He was already in a bad mood. Although the weather wasn't much better, at least there was a refreshing smell. There was a dilapidated hut in front of him. From the nearby traces, it should have been a small village. However, it had been abandoned for too long. Most of the buildings had long collapsed, and only a small hut made of stone remained. Han Jin's figure suddenly changed direction. After a few leaps, he arrived at the door of the hut. This place could barely shelter him from the rain, but Han Jin was a clean freak. He didn't want to go inside, so he stood at the door. The water vapor rising from his body became thicker and thicker, almost enveloping his entire body. Not long after, an old man came from another direction. That old man was dressed very strangely. Even the most depraved beggar paled in comparison. His white hair was messy and draped over his back, almost reaching his waist. Only God knew how long it had been since he last had a haircut. The front of his beard was thick and long, covering his entire chest. The wrinkles on his face were so deep that they didn't even look like wrinkles anymore. It was as if someone had randomly slashed his face dozens of times. He was barefoot and his feet were covered in mud. His tattered clothes had long been soaked and wrapped messily around his body. Looking at the old man's direction, it seemed that he wanted to walk to the door of the hut. However, when he saw Han Jin and the water vapor rising from Han Jin's body, his eyes suddenly lit up. He looked at Han Jin with interest. Chapter 370. The protests of the weak against the strong were usually meaningless and ineffective. Of course, Yelena knew this. She expressed her grievances not to condemn Han Jin, but to get something in return. Now, she got what she wanted. However, feeling Han Jin's caress, a strong sense of sleepiness floated up to her eyebrows. Yelena yawned lazily, leaned on Han Jin's shoulder, and gradually fell asleep. Was it a bad thing or a good thing to know more? No one could say for sure. Even the smartest person could not find an absolutely correct answer. Just like Han Jin and Yelena at this moment. Yelena knew nothing about what had happened, so she was very satisfied and happy. Even in her dreams, she smiled sweetly. Although Han Jin was also smiling, how much of his smile was from the bottom of his heart? After a long time, Han Jin gently supported Yelena's body, then put her on the bed and covered her with a blanket. He quietly looked at her for a moment, then slowly walked out of the room. The entire God of War was a magic weapon. Whether it was day or night, every corner of the ship would scatter a natural light, enough for people to see. Of course, if someone felt uncomfortable, they had to light torches or candles in the room, or even install a magic lamp. This was up to the individual's wishes. Han Jin never interfered. After all, it was impossible for a fire to break out. From one side of the corridor, he could clearly see the other side. It was already very late and there was no one around. Han Jin stood silently for a while, then slowly walked forward. When he reached a room, he paused for a moment, then pushed the door open and walked in. The room was empty. It had been a long time since anyone had lived in it. The blanket was neatly placed at the head of the bed. Compared to the other rooms, this room was more or less the same. The only difference was that there were all kinds of large and small vases, even under the corner of the bed. Each vase was filled with fresh flowers, and a burst of fragrance filled the room. Han Jin closed the door and slowly walked forward until he reached the bedside. He sighed and slowly fell onto the bed. He still didn't want to sleep, but he hadn't slept for 2 days. Finally, he couldn't suppress the strong fatigue and closed his eyes. Early in the morning, the door of the room was pushed open and a girl walked in while humming a tune. Han Jin immediately woke up from his sleep and opened his eyes. It was Miriam. She was carrying a large wooden bucket with both hands. The bucket was filled with water and looked very heavy. Miriam had just placed the bucket on the floor when she saw Han Jin sitting up on the bed. She was shocked. "Young master? Why are you here? Come and take a look." Han Jin nodded. His gaze swept past Miriam, and he saw the water in the large wooden bucket. "You come here every day to clean?" "Yes, young master." There was a hint of fear in Miriam's eyes. Everyone knew about what happened to Sunir, and there was no need to keep Sunir's room. However, Han Jin had never mentioned it, and no one was willing to bring it up. Only Miriam, just like when Sunir was still alive, came here every day to clean the room. Even the flowers in the vase were changed by her. She did this out of gratitude, as Sunir had always been very good to her. Now that she was caught red-handed by Han Jin, she was a little afraid. She was afraid that Han Jin would blame her for being a busybody. However, she didn't dare to lie to Han Jin, so she could only tell him the truth. "Where are the others? Are they all up?" "Yes. Everyone is having breakfast on the deck." Han Jin stood up and tidied his robes before slowly walking out. When Han Jin walked past Miriam, she secretly breathed a sigh of relief. She even patted her chest lightly. Han Jin walked to the door and suddenly stopped. "Miriam." "Ah? Young master?" Miriam was shocked again. "You are about to be a bride. Leave this kind of chores to someone else," Han Jin said softly. "Also, thank you. I am used to it, young master." "I am not tired at all," Miriam hurriedly replied. However, her eyes were filled with confusion. "Thank you? What does that mean?" Han Jin smiled and walked down the corridor to the stairs. Everyone was having their meal on the deck. In a short period of time, Leslie and Lorraine had become familiar with everyone, especially Leslie. No matter where she went, she was always the active one. In comparison, Harley, who was supposed to be more active, was very depressed at this moment. In fact, whenever everyone gathered for a meal, Harley would become depressed because he could not eat anything. He could only use memories to make up for his regrets. However, how could memories be compared to cups of pure white milk, fragrant bread, and roasted meat? Yelena was holding a tray and looking around. When she saw Han Jin walking up the stairs, she hurriedly passed through the crowd and followed beside him with a smile. Of course, the food on the tray was for 2 people. The people on the God of War were all privileged people in the Holy Crown City. However, no one put on airs here. Even people like Guevara and Major Domo Gale, who were over 60 years old, had to get their own food. This atmosphere was brought up by Han Jin. Most of the time, it was Stilberg who prepared breakfast for him. If he woke up early, he would prepare Stilberg's share. If Han Jin could be so casual, the others could not be so particular. Han Jin found a table and sat down. Yelena first placed the food on the table and then sat beside Han Jin. "Raphael, where did you go?" Morrison's asked. "Sleeping," Han Jin replied. "Yelena has been waiting for you for a long time. She also went to your bedroom to look for you, but you were not there." Morrison said. "I woke up early and went out," Han Jin said as if nothing had happened. "Oh." Morrison's did not ask any more. Han Jin was now in a high position, so it was normal for him to go out and do something. The table where Guevara and Major Domo Gale were sitting was very quiet, but the young people were much more lively. Sassu and Leger were talking enthusiastically. From the occasional words, it seemed that they were planning to go for a spring walk somewhere. Leslie and Lorraine were also very interested. One of the three Holy Knight, Amij, was also there. Amij's achievements were far beyond those young people, but he was not arrogant at all. He naturally sat with Morrison's and the others. Seeing Han Jin's gaze sweep over him, Amij bowed slightly and nodded to Han Jin. Then he whispered something to Sasu beside him. A few mountain warriors jumped onto the deck from the side of the ship. They turned around and pulled the ropes, pulling up large boxes. Then, Fabian climbed up from below. When he saw that Han Jin and the others were having breakfast, he hesitated, not knowing if he should come over. Han Jin had already seen Fabian and waved his hand. Fabian was originally the warden of the Holy Crown City. On the day Han Jin took over the city, he immediately changed his position and was very cooperative from beginning to end. Now he was promoted by Han Jin and became the deputy of the new noble Schumann. Schumann was the chief sheriff, but he focused all his energy on tracking down the mysterious organization. In fact, Fabian was in charge of the security of the Holy Crown City. "What's the matter?" Han Jin asked. "My lord, this is the last batch of dragon blood." Fabian smiled. "The last batch?" "Yes, my lord. The dragon can't hold on any longer." "Then don't let it suffer anymore. Let's kill it." Han Jin smiled. "Let me do it. Let me do it." Morrisons shouted, "Haha! From now on, I am also a dragon slayer." "Dragon slayer?" Leslie and Lorraine turned around at the same time, looking at Morrisons with shining eyes. "It's like this, Leslie. We have a dragon in our prison. Now that it's useless to us, we have to kill it." Cessation explained with a smile. "Don't think that he really dares to challenge the dragon." Leger curled his lips. "I am sitting so far away, what are you still worried about? Are you still targeting me?" Morrison's university was angry. Leger's face blushed, which was rare. Then he looked away and ignored Morrison's. "Let me do it." Leslie was so happy that she didn't even bother to eat breakfast. She walked to Han Jin in a few steps and said in a pleading tone, "Raphael, let me do it, please?" Morrison's face fell, and he sat back in his chair weakly. Han Jin didn't have to say anything. He knew in his heart that since Leslie begged Han Jin in such a tone, the honor of being a dragon slayer would have nothing to do with him. Even if Han Jin still let him do it, he wouldn't be able to withstand the pressure from all sides. "Okay." Han Jin smiled and said, "Yelena, after breakfast, go with them." Han Jin was worried about accidents. After all, it was a dragon. "Okay." Yelena nodded. Leslie lowered her head and whispered in Han Jin's ear, "Brother-in-law, you are so nice." After that, she smiled and stared at Yelena. In her eyes, Han Jin and Yelena were a match made in heaven. They had the same status, appearance, and strength. There was no better match than these two. "What are you talking about?" Yelena was curious. "Nothing." Leslie rolled her eyes and said, "I just told Raphael that I like him, very, very much." Then she ran away with a smile before Yelena could respond. This little troublemaker. Yelena was angry and amused at the same time. Guevara stood up and walked to Han Jin's side. He smiled and said, "You don't blame me for disturbing you, right?" "What are you talking about?" Yelena was a little shy, but she knew that if Guevara said this, it meant that he approved of her relationship with Han Jin. In fact, not only Guevara but the others also approved of it. "Raphael, about the orc messenger, have you thought about it?" Guevara's eyes moved to Han Jin. "Yes." Han Jin nodded and said, "But I can't do this. You should deal with them." "Me? Then what should I say to them?" "This time, I killed hundreds of shamans, Force's brother, Euthania, and 2 behemoths. I have a big grudge." Han Jin smiled and said, "So, we have to give Force a trustworthy reason." 2 behemoths? Guevara was surprised. "Have you fought with a behemoth before?" "No, but I know that a behemoth is a top creature comparable to a dragon." "Raphael, you are getting stronger and stronger." Guevara sighed. "I just used a trick." The behemoth's magic defense is pitifully weak. Han Jin smiled and said, "Now I know why Forza gave up Fado City. If he continued to fight with Grand Duke Solomon, he would never see the dawn of victory. Grand Duke Solomon's power has been recognized by the continent for decades. He is the star of magic. However, we can't just watch Forza transfer his hatred to us." Han Jin pondered for a moment and said, "This time, I had a simple contact with Lydia and some great elves. I found that they were very dissatisfied with the United Senate because Lydia had warned them to be vigilant against the orcs. However, the Senate didn't care at all and insisted on forming an alliance with the orcs. The orcs suddenly fell out with them, which made the United Senate face a very serious crisis of trust." Guevara didn't plan to talk to Han Jin, so he just listened quietly. The greater the pressure the elves face, the more intense the internal conflicts will be. In the end, both sides of the conflict may choose an extreme way. Han Jin thought and said, "So, we must let Forza focus on the elves. As for you, it's best to keep a low profile and ask for the understanding of the orcs." "Understanding? You killed so many of them. How can you understand me?" "There are many reasons. For example, I was pressured by Grand Duke Solomon to take action. My relationship with Yelena shouldn't be a secret, right? In fact, what I want to do most is to sit on top of the mountain and watch the tigers fight. This is in line with my interests." Han Jin said slowly, "Forza will believe you. What in the world can move people more than interest? What's more, the elves have been defeated, which is a good time for him to pursue the victory. We are unharmed, so it is unlikely that Forza will turn around and attack us. Of course, we can't continue to provoke Forza. Sit on top of the mountain and watch the tigers fight. This is a good sentence, and it's very appropriate." Guevara smiled and said, "But, Raphael, this wasn't your original plan, right? I didn't know that the internal conflicts of the elves had become so intense." Han Jin replied softly, "Moreover, the elves have now found their new leader. I can feel that he has great influence." "Who is it?" "Gao Bin." "Gao Bin? Gao Bin. This name sounds familiar." Guevara frowned and thought for a moment. Suddenly, his eyes lit up. "The sharpshooter Gao Bin?" When Gao Bin was in this area, Guevara was just a child, so it took him a long time to remember. "Do you know him?" "No, I don't." Guevara smiled bitterly. "But decades ago, if I had the chance to be friends with him, I would be willing to kill myself." At this time, Leslie, Lorraine, and the others had just finished their breakfast. They hurriedly called Fabian, the deputy sheriff, to go to the prison together. Slaying a dragon. What a fun thing to do. In the capital of elements, this kind of opportunity had never appeared before. Yelena also stood up. "Raphael, if you don't have anything else to do, why don't you come with us?" "I won't be going." Han Jin stretched out his hand and pointed at the big boxes. This morning, he still had to absorb the energy of the dragon's blood, so he didn't have time to go out and slay a dragon. Yelena alone was enough to take care of him. "Then I'll be going." Yelena smiled and nodded at Guevara. Then, she led the cheering Leslie, Lorraine, and Sasu to the side of the ship. "Raphael, you want to work with that Gao Bin?" Guevara's face became serious. "But I have to remind you that he is a madman." "No, he and Lydia together are two madmen. I have a rough understanding of his past." Han Jin said softly, "If I only want to use the elves, it is very unwise to work with Gao Bin. But if I really want to work with the elves, Gao Bin is a very good choice. At least, it is much better than working with the senators. Since you have decided, then I can't say anything more." Guevara sighed and then changed the topic. "Raphael, is there something on your mind? I noticed that when you talked about Gao Bin, there was something wrong with your expression." Han Jin was silent. After a while, he said in a low voice, "I heard about Sunir. What happened to her?" "That Prudence treated her badly?" Guevara showed a look of pity. Actually, I guessed it. With Sunir's personality, even if she married Prudence, she would not turn around and frame you. It must be that Prudence did something terrible and forced Sunir to do it. No, that is a fake Sunir. Han Jin's voice became deeper. A fake Sunir? What do you mean? Guevara was stunned. The real Sunir has been in the illusion of the temple in Wild Willow City and has never come out. Guevara was stunned for a longer time than Han Jin. After a while, he lowered his voice. What do you want to do? Give up on her? No, why would I? Han Jin shook his head. I admit that I accepted her because I was touched at first. But now I like her more and more. I like her smile, I like to see her acting cute in front of me. It has nothing to do with responsibility. I don't want to leave her, and I don't want to hurt her. Also, seeing a famous cold beauty show her true colors in front of me, I feel a sense of accomplishment. You are still in the mood to joke. Guevara looked helpless. He saw Han Jin and Sunir walking over and knew the relationship between the two. So you want to give up on Sunir? No. No? Guevara almost choked on his own saliva. If he was eating something now, he would definitely spit it out. Han Jin closed his mouth, but his eyes were bright. For a man, this is nothing. When I was young, I had more than 10 wives. Guevara's laughter stopped abruptly as he thought of his home that had been turned into ruins. He could not help but feel a pang of pain in his heart. However, he had strong self-control and maintained a calm expression. Moreover, didn't Solomon also have a few wives? But what? Did you notice? Just now, Leslie was joking with you, but Yelena was not angry at all. On one hand, she saw Leslie as her sister. On the other hand, she grew up in that kind of environment. I heard you say that Solomon's wives have a good relationship. There is no jealousy, suspicion, or aggression between them. So, as long as you use the right method, it will not be difficult to convince her. Guevara paused. But Sunir is different, Han Jin was silent again. He could not answer Guevara's concerns. Chapter 371. On top of the city wall of Wild Willow City, the elves on duty were still patrolling as usual. They walked leisurely and didn't forget to greet or joke with their companions when they passed by. It had been a long time since anyone dared to attack Wild Willow City, so these patrolling elves had already treated patrolling as a routine. Suddenly, the earth began to tremble slightly. All the elves felt something strange and simultaneously looked towards the distance. At the end of the horizon, smoke and dust filled the sky as if there were countless fierce beasts running wildly. After a while, as the smoke and dust continued to move forward, the elves with good eyesight could see that there were figures flashing in the smoke and dust. They were actually orc warriors riding on wind wolves. Didn't they already form an alliance with the orcs? Then how could they explain the scene in front of them? Looking at their murderous appearance, even the stupidest elves wouldn't think that those orcs came with good intentions. Enemy attack! An elf shouted hoarsely and rang the alarm bell beside him. For a moment, the bell on top of the city wall rang loudly, and the patrolling elves immediately became busy. Some were reporting, some were on alert, and all of them were in a mess. A few minutes later, the 10th rank ranger Athena stood on top of the city wall and calmly looked at the orc army that was gradually approaching from afar. Currently, she was the strongest in Wild Willow City. The elves didn't hold back in their expansion this time, so there were only a little more than 1,000 elves left in Wild Willow City, and not all of them were combatants. A 10th rank ranger leading less than 1,000 elven warriors, compared to the aggressive orc army, was like a small boat in the ocean. No matter how you looked at it, it seemed like it would be destroyed at any time. However, Athena, who had followed Lydia through fire and water for dozens of years, didn't show the slightest fear. Seeing Athena's calm expression, the originally panicked elven warriors gradually calmed down. Although they weren't strong enough and didn't even pass the illusion trial, they had enough courage to fight. Moreover, every elf firmly believed that the wild willow city under their feet was indestructible. It was like this in the past, and it would be like this in the future. Following Athena's order, the elf warriors quickly hid behind the city wall. Sharp arrows shot out from the gaps of the vines wrapped around the city wall, like ferocious beasts that only chose people to devour. The orc army was getting closer and closer. Thousands of orc warriors riding on gale wolves were running all the way. Athena could even see the bloodstains on the weapons in the hands of the orcs. Then, Athena's gaze suddenly froze, and her pupils suddenly contracted. Behind the orc warriors, more than a dozen tall and sturdy figures appeared. Every step they took, they crossed a distance of 5 or 6 meters. Their wide feet hit the ground, making muffled sounds. These giants could actually keep up with the wind wolves' footsteps with only 2 legs. What was even more frightening was that each giant was holding a frighteningly large stone in their arms. Hill giant. It was a mountain giant. Although Athena controlled her facial expression very well, she couldn't suppress the shock in her heart. In the orc system, the mountain giant was in existence second only to the behemoth. This referred to their fighting strength, and had nothing to do with their intelligence. Especially in a siege battle, perhaps the shamans couldn't do anything when looking at the high city wall, but the mountain giants could use their innate strength to destroy the seemingly indestructible city wall with the stones in their hands. It could be said that Athena didn't put those thousands of orc warriors in her eyes because no matter how high the wind wolves jumped, they couldn't jump over the high city wall of Wild Willow City. Moreover, it wasn't a city wall in the ordinary sense. There had been many invaders who tried to climb over it, but they all died under the green vines. However, with the appearance of the mountain giants, Athena's confidence began to waver. But things had already come to this point, she couldn't take a step back. Athena's figure was straight, and her eagle-like sharp eyes stared at those mountain giants. If she wanted to protect Wild Willow City, the most important thing was to kill these guys who had unparalleled long-range attack ability. The charging speed of the orc army was very fast. When they were about 500 meters away from Wild Willow City, a mountain giant suddenly threw out the stone in his hand. A muffled thunder-like whistling sound followed, and the stone flew straight over at an incredible speed with the sound of wind and thunder. With a loud bang, the stone heavily smashed on the city wall, and suddenly burst into pieces of various sizes, flying in all directions. The vines near the point where the stone landed also caved in, and the messy broken branches and leaves splashed all over the sky. Athena could clearly feel that the ground under her feet also trembled. The orc warriors immediately began to cheer, waving the weapons in their hands while shouting. Greedy and bloody gazes appeared in the eyes of every orc. Wild Willow City wasn't just a city to them, it also meant endless wealth and women. Of course, the city wall of Wild Willow City couldn't be destroyed by this attack. The vines grew very fast, and in the blink of an eye, the green barrier was restored to its original state. It didn't look like it had just been attacked. But even if Athena didn't see it, it was very clear that a huge dent was left on the brick wall. Such a fierce attack couldn't be blocked by the vines alone. The elven warriors nervously stared at Athena, waiting for the order to attack. Just because they weren't strong enough didn't mean they were ignorant. All the elves on the scene knew that if such an attack was allowed to continue, then the collapse of the city wall was only a matter of time. At this moment, the front of the orc army was less than 400 meters away from Wild Willow City. This was the maximum range that normal elven archers could deal damage to. A single volley of elven archers would take down at least 100 orc warriors. But Athena didn't seem to notice the anxious gazes around her. She just stood there quietly, as if she was waiting for something. "My lady, are you still not giving the order?" A male elf beside Athena couldn't help but ask. "Wait a little longer." Athena's gaze never left the hill giants, silently calculating the distance in her heart. Another hill giant threw out the stone in his hand with all his might. It looked exactly the same as the previous attack. The same whistling sound came, and the same smashed on the city wall. Then, gravel and broken branches filled the sky, and the green barrier silently filled the gap. The most important thing was that Athena noticed that the two attacks landed on the same spot. A trace of surprise flashed through her eyes. Since when did these simple-minded hill giants become so smart? If this continues, perhaps we won't even last the time I estimated, Athena thought as she slowly raised her right hand. Finally, when the third hill giant raised the stone in his hand, Athena's hand fiercely chopped down. Target, hill giants. Thousands of arrows left the bowstring and whistled like a storm, instantly enveloping the dozen or so hill giant. At the same time, Athena took out a small and exquisite dark red arrow from her quiver with lightning speed and raised her hand to shoot. In the face of the oncoming rain of arrows, the hill giants who still had rocks in their hands simply raised the rocks to block half of their bodies. As for those without rocks, they crossed their arms in front of their bodies to prevent their faces and chests from being shot. As for the other parts of their bodies, they didn't care at all. The orcs were never afraid of injuries. The hill giant who was about to throw the stone in his hand was no exception. He also used the stone in front of his body to block. This was their best and only way to deal with long-range attack. The arrows hit the stone and made a crisp sound of breaking. After all, not every elf had outstanding strength. If they could shoot through the huge stone, perhaps they would have gone out with the army instead of staying here. At the same time, there was also the sound of arrows piercing into flesh. Although the rocks were big enough, they were not big enough to block their entire bodies. However, the sturdy muscles of the giants made it so that the arrows could only pierce a very shallow part of their bodies before they were unable to go any further. To the giants, this kind of injury was like being bitten by an insect. Although it was painful, it did not affect their fighting strength at all. Many things had a good side, but at the same time, there was also a bad side to it. The stones in the hands of the giants carried out their mission very well. They blocked countless arrows for the giants, but at the same time, they also blocked the giants' sight. The moment the rain of arrows was about to fall, a small red light shot out like lightning. The huge stone suddenly became fragile in front of this small red light. The red light effortlessly penetrated the stone and came out from the other side. The giant behind the stone only had time to feel a sharp pain between his eyebrows. Then, all of his consciousness had left him. It wasn't until the red light came out from the back of the giant's head that it slowed down the momentum. It was a small dark red arrow. The orc warriors let out an angry roar and urged the wind wolves under them to speed up. The hill giants were also furious. They raised the huge stones in their hands and made a throwing motion. On the city wall, Athena lowered the bow in her hand. She looked a little tired, but when she saw the reaction of the orcs, she couldn't help but feel happy. This was the effect she wanted. As long as the hill giants didn't attack in one place, she was confident that she could hold on for a long time. As for what to do after that, she didn't know. She only knew that she had to protect the wall under her feet. No matter if it was blood or life, she had to hold on firmly. "I'll leave it to you." This was what Lydia said to her before she left. Her tone was light, and she still looked as calm as ever. But Athena, who had never been on her own, clearly felt an invisible burden pressing down on her at that moment. These simple words hovered in Athena's mind, lingering for a long time. "Leave it to me." Athena tightly gripped the bow in her hand. "I'll let those barbarians see what kind of unforgivable sin they have committed." At this moment, a bleak and low horn sound suddenly sounded on the battlefield. The charging orc warriors simultaneously slowed down. The hill giants also hesitantly put down their stone arms. Although they still looked very angry, none of them launched another attack. The sound of the bugle horn suddenly changed and became louder. Then, an incredible scene appeared. The orc warriors that were known for their rampage and disorder on the battlefield actually retreated in an orderly manner, as if they were a well-trained army. When the orcs all stopped, Athena's expression changed. With her accurate vision as a 10th grade ranger, the orcs were standing exactly 600 meters away from Wild Willow City. The formation of the orcs didn't change. The warriors were still in front, and the giants were behind. But Athena knew very well that this meant that the arrows of her elven warriors could no longer cause any effective damage to the orcs. But for the hill giants, this distance wasn't their limit. A hill giant threw a huge stone in his hand. The stone hit the wall in a parabola, and then the second, the third. Obviously, this kind of throwing method wasn't in line with the usual style of the hill giants, leading to much lower accuracy. But only in this way could the giants ensure that the stone would hit the wall with great force after flying for 600 meters. There were even times when the rocks smashed into the city walls and bounced off the ground. This kind of irregular movement caught the elves off guard, and in a short period of time, over a dozen elves either had their limbs broken or lost their lives. 400 meters away, behind the orc army, a group of silhouettes appeared, running back and forth. They kept throwing huge stones into the hands of the hill giants. It looked like they planned to keep throwing stones at this distance until the wall collapsed. Was this still the wisdom of the orcs? But at this time, she didn't have time to think too much. Athena suppressed the astonishment in her heart and took out a dark red arrow, slowly pulling the bowstring. With a whoosh, the arrow left the bowstring and turned into a faint red light. This arrow's target was still the forehead of a hill giant. A warrior at the front of the orc army suddenly jumped high from the Gale Wolf and waved the weapon in his hand to meet the red light. After an explosion, the red light shattered the weapon in the orc's hand and shot towards the target without slowing down. Another orc warrior jumped into the air under Athena's surprised gaze. Perhaps because he didn't have time to meet the attack with his weapon, this orc directly used his body to block the red light. Even the huge stone couldn't stop the red light. No matter how sturdy the orc's body was, it couldn't withstand a single blow in front of this seemingly indestructible red light. That orc's body was penetrated by the red light without any suspense, and blood burst out from his back. At this time, the hill giant targeted by Athena had just used the stone in his hand to block in front of him. God had given them unparalleled power, but didn't give them the reaction speed to match it. In the face of such a high-grade archer's attack, he had no other choice but to resist. After being blocked twice, the red light's speed had slowed down a bit. Although it still shot into the stone, it didn't have the power to break out of the stone and shoot the hill giant hiding behind it. That hill giant slowly put down the stone, revealing his ugly big face. When he found that he didn't suffer any damage, he couldn't help but grin. The orc warriors suddenly became quiet for a few seconds, and then burst out with excited shouts. Of course they were excited. The most troublesome thing for the orcs had always been the high-grade elves sniping. This time, they had successfully protected a hill giant from the high-grade elves' arrows. It really made them proud. As for their companion who had just died, it didn't seem to matter. How could an ordinary orc warrior be compared to a hill giant? Athena's face was pale after shooting the second arrow, as if all the strength in her body had been exhausted, but she still stood there straight. Only the dripping sweat on her forehead quietly betrayed her exhaustion. "Madam, go and rest for a while. Looks like you'll be fine for a while," the male elf beside Athena whispered. Athena stubbornly shook her head. "Wilpner, the moment I stood here, I already had this awareness. Either I stand until victory, or I die here." The male elf called Wilpner's side and secretly moved forward a little. This way, he would have enough time to block in front of Athena when the stone fell. Athena of course saw Wilpner's small movements. Her lips moved, but she didn't say anything in the end. She clearly knew what this subordinate was thinking. She didn't say it out loud because she was afraid that he would feel awkward, and now there was even less need to say it out loud. According to the current situation, if there were no reinforcements, the city would fall sooner or later. Since death was not far away, then let him do what he wanted to do. The chaotic stones bombarded the city wall one after another. The green barrier was also unceasingly repairing the damaged areas. However, the wall under the vines had already begun to become mottled. There were even cracks in the most serious areas. Athena stood there quietly, waiting for her strength to recover. Her eyes never left the hill giant. Even at the last moment, I will fight to the end. Wild Willow City never lacked the courage to face death. Moreover, now was not the time to despair. The guardian of Wild Willow City was the ancient Tree of Life. Its power far surpassed that of the ordinary Tree of Life that grew from the seeds of life. If there was really no other way, she would not hesitate to destroy all the enemies. Chapter 372. Han Jin gently placed the last bottle on the table, then crossed his legs and closed his eyes to regulate his breathing. The vital energy in his body had become thicker and thicker. After absorbing the energy of Dragon City Elder Maxwell, and the dragon in the prison had provided him with dragon blood several times, his total vital energy had broken through 500 Xian. This also meant that he could absorb the energy of an 8th-grade magic crystal. Although he was still far from the 10,000 profound realm of the indestructible golden body, if he continued to cultivate at this speed, he would be able to reach the pinnacle of transcendence in a few years. If he was lucky enough to kill a dozen or more dragons, the time would be even shorter. A smile appeared at the corner of Han Jin's mouth. He then slowly closed his eyes, adjusted his breathing, concealed his spirit, and entered a state of meditation. After some time, someone knocked on the door, then Harley's voice came from outside. "Master? Master? Harley, what's the matter? Master, are you free now? Master Amijay wants to see you," Harley shouted. Han Jin moved his body slightly, moved to the bedside, and said softly, "Let him in." In fact, he had already seen Amijay during breakfast, but he was eager to absorb the energy of the dragon blood. Although the method of storing dragon blood provided by Yelena was very effective, it could not completely prevent the dissipation of energy. It could only slow down the dissipation of energy. Other things could wait, but the dragon blood could not wait. Therefore, after breakfast, Han Jin asked the mountain warriors to move the big boxes to his room. Han Jin also understood that Amijay had been on the God of War for a long time. Seeing that he had not come out for a long time, he asked Harley to find him. Amijay walked in with a smile. The faint smell of blood in the room attracted his attention. Amijay could not help but sniff lightly. His eyes swept across the piled-up bottles. Although Han Jin had tried his best to pour out all the dragon blood, there was still some red stuff left on the walls of the bottles. However, Amijay was a man of propriety. He turned his eyes away and smiled. "Master, I hope I didn't disturb you." "It's fine. Have a seat." Han Jin pointed at the chair. "What's the matter? Have you used up all the magic scrolls I gave you? How is that possible? I'm already very satisfied with one a day." Amij said, "Sir, I'm not flattering you. The magic scrolls you made are amazing, really amazing." Isn't that a compliment? Of course not. Sir, there are some things that I don't know if I should say, Amiji said as he sat down on the chair. Go ahead. Han Jin smiled. Judging from your expression, you seem to be under a lot of pressure. It's not me who's under a lot of pressure, it's His Holiness. Ai Mijia sighed. Jades? What happened? There are two kinds of power in this world. One is the sword in your hand, and the other is money. Haha, my lord, perhaps you think I'm too shallow, but that's what I've always thought. Amij laughed. You're not wrong. Han Jin nodded. Since we rebuilt the Vatican in the Holy Crown City, many things require money, a lot of money, and these are all provided by you. Logically speaking, we should be grateful to you, but in fact, go ahead, I won't mind. Han Jin paused for a moment and added, I'm glad you came to talk to me about this. In fact, some cardinals are very dissatisfied with you. AI Mijie smiled bitterly. They're not greedy people. The reason is, before the fall of the unsetting sun mountain, our Vatican had a source of tax, and it was quite rich. But here we have nothing. The contrast is too great, and some people inevitably feel a sense of loss. No matter what we want to do, we have to ask for your permission, because this is your territory, and the people living here are your people. What's more, we escaped in a hurry, and the things we brought with us were pitiful. Without your support, what can we do? So, a few cardinal bishops put forward very sharp opinions. They said that our throats are already in the hands of the human. If this goes on for a little longer, the Holy See can only become your vassal. This is the greatest insult to all believers, and even to the God of light. How can the spokesperson of God submit to the feet of a human? Go on. Han Jin said softly. Those cardinals propose to reissue the Order of God's Grace. Order of God's Grace? Han Jin interrupted. You know? AI Mijie was stunned. Yes. This idea is too stupid. They're like a group of spoiled children, always venting their complaints and dissatisfaction at inappropriate times, but never thinking about why or why. AI Mijie's eyes were full of helplessness. Unfortunately, I'm too young to be qualified to participate in church affairs. Among the three of us Holy Knight, only Adonis can speak a few words. The Pope only has the support of a few cardinals. Even with Adonis, their voices are still too weak compared to the opposition. You mean, even Jeds can't control the situation? Han Jin said slowly. Yes, but no one knows how long he can control it. AI Mijie grinned. I'm afraid when that day comes, there will be a large-scale bloody conflict. Since you can come to me, it means that you already have some ideas, right? I knew I couldn't hide it from you. AI Mijie laughed. What do you want me to do? Sir, can you carve out a parish for us in the Holy Crown City? AI Mijie said while observing Han Jin's expression. This way, you'll be relieved of a big burden, and the Holy See will also have a sense of security. Personally, I think this will be good for both of us. However, AI Mijie was disappointed. He observed for a long time, but could not catch the change in Han Jin's mood. After a long while, Han Jin said softly, Do you think I will agree to this request? AI Mijie was stunned. He pondered for a moment and smiled bitterly. The possibility of agreeing is very small. Although the size of the parish was flexible, the essence of this problem could not be ignored. Han Jin had become the supreme ruler of the Holy Crown City. Carving out a parish meant that Han Jin could no longer control that area. This was undoubtedly a big nail in Han Jin's body. Which king would allow a country within a country to exist? Since you know, then there's no need for us to continue this discussion. But AI Mijie was still a little unwilling. Mijie, I sincerely want to be friends with you, but that doesn't mean that I have to give up my own flesh and blood to please my friends. To be honest, friendships that are built with one-sided sacrifice won't last long. Han Jin smiled. Moreover, human desires have no limit. I've made a sacrifice today to satisfy you, Jeds, and all the cardinals. But soon, some of you will make new demands. The feeling of reaping without sowing is wonderful. What's more, my concession has exposed my cowardice. Do you really think they will be satisfied? Sir, I can assure you of this. You can't guarantee it. Han Jin interrupted. You can control a person's life and death, but can you control a person's desires? Haha. Being able to completely control yourself, even just controlling yourself, is already considered rare and precious. AI Mijie was silent and looked at Han Jin quietly. He did not expect Han Jin's attitude to be so firm. If you say that if I insist on not giving in, it is likely to lead to a conflict, then can I understand it this way? The friendship you speak of is just to force me to give in. Han Jin said slowly. This kind of friendship can be abandoned. My lord, I think you've misunderstood me. AI Mijia smiled bitterly. We only want a small parish. We don't need a large population. Even if it's just a street, we'll be satisfied. AI Mijia, does Jeds know that you came to see me? Han Jin smiled and changed the topic. His Holiness doesn't know. Why didn't Jeds come to see me? His Holiness, because he knows me. He knows that I would never agree. Sir, it's just a small parish. There's no need to be so nervous, right? AI Mijia's expression became even more bitter. There's no big or small principle. It just depends on whether you can stick to it, Han Jin said softly. Also, many cardinals supported Jedza's coronation ceremony. What about now? Has he become the Pope? Amiji heaved a sigh of relief. He knew about this and agreed with Jedza's decision to keep a low profile. If there was a Pope in the Holy Crown City, what position would Han Jin be placed in? AI Mijia, it's not just you who have the right to abandon friendship. I also have the right. Han Jin smiled. Do you understand what I mean? AI Mijia was speechless. Han Jin's attitude was very sharp. He even hinted that there was a possibility of a complete falling out. AI Mijia's purpose on board the God of War was to negotiate, not to completely anger Han Jin. Faced with the current deadlock, he could only remain silent. Han Jin still wanted to say something, but his expression suddenly froze. He immediately stood up. AI Mijia, let's talk later. Or you can wait for me for a while. AI Mijia saw that Han Jin's expression was not right and hurriedly asked, Sir, what happened? You can't help me, Han Jin said as he strode towards the door. Harley was talking loudly on the deck when he suddenly saw Han Jin shoot up from the stairs. He stretched out his hand and Harley's figure instantly disappeared without a trace. Then Han Jin jumped over the side of the ship and fell straight down. When Guevara and Majordomo Gale rushed over in confusion, Han Jin's figure had already disappeared. Asterisk, sir, this way. A thin middle-aged man in front of them held a torch as he turned back and said, Be careful. Shu Man glanced around nervously. He had never thought that an ordinary house would have an underground passage that led directly to the abyss world. They had been walking for a long time and had changed a few torches, but they still could not see the end. More than a dozen mountain warriors surrounded Shuman, each of them holding a long sword in their hands. They were personally assigned to Shuman by Han Jin. On one hand, they were to protect Shuman's safety, and on the other hand, they were to assist Shuman in his investigation. Sir, don't worry. I have already checked. Those people are not here. We can go over and quietly raid their nest. The thin middle-aged man laughed. David, how much longer do we have to walk? Are you sure we didn't go the wrong way? Shuman asked. Wrong way? Sir, you are questioning my professional ability. The middle-aged man in front shook his head. After walking past a fork in the road, the middle-aged man suddenly stopped and carefully touched a dent in the wall of the cave. Then, he turned around and put his index finger in front of his lips, shushing them. Shuman and the mountain warriors could not help but lower their voices and move forward carefully step by step. The middle-aged man slowly poked his head out and glanced at the fork in the road. He nodded vigorously, then placed the torch in his hand on the ground and stepped on it. The torch was quietly extinguished. The other mountain warriors followed suit and extinguished their torches one by one. The world quickly fell into darkness. At this moment, a sharp whistling sound rang out, mixed with people's screams, groans, and the sound of flesh colliding. Although Shuman's strength was very weak, he could sense that someone was constantly rushing around him. However, he did not dare to move. Without the light, he lost his vision and did not know where to move. After a few minutes, the surroundings became quiet. Shuman tentatively stretched out his hand and drew a half-circle around him, but he did not feel anything. He did not dare to speak loudly as he was shocked and afraid. With a whoosh, something in front of him lit up. David lit the torch again. Seeing David again, Schumann could not help but let out a long sigh of relief. Then, his face suddenly stiffened. At his feet there were more than 10 mountain warriors' corpses. In the few minutes of chaos just now, the mountain warriors were all killed. If Schumann did not have a certain level of psychological quality, he would have screamed out loud. To him, this kind of scene was really too terrifying. David held the torch in his right hand and looked at Schumann with a smile. Schumann's strength was not much, but his mind was very agile. This was also the reason why he was valued by Han Jin. David, you betrayed me? Schumann finally could not hold it in and let out an angry roar. David only smiled and did not answer. Cough cough. A few coughs came from behind. Schumann turned around bit by bit and saw a white-haired old man squatting in front of the mountain warrior's corpse, carefully observing something. Then, a dagger appeared in his hand and he gently stabbed it into the back of a mountain warrior's ear. Then, he slashed it down and flicked it up. The dagger drew a line of blood on the corpse's neck and connected the ears. Then, he took out a bottle of medicine and sprinkled it on the blood. Schumann did not know what the old man was doing. He held his breath and observed, but his legs also trembled slightly at the same time. The old man took out another piece of black cloth and covered the mountain warrior's face. After waiting for a moment, he suddenly pulled with force, and a scalp-numbing tearing sound rang out. The mountain warrior's face had already become a bloody mess, and his entire face had disappeared without a trace. Then, the old man shook off the black cloth, and it turned out that the missing face was tightly attached to the black cloth. Schumann couldn't help but howl like a pig being slaughtered. He even almost peed in his pants. Brain was brain, experience was experience. Since he was young, he had seen some cruel killing scenes, but today was the first time he had seen a person's face being peeled off alive. David! Schumann screamed. It was unknown whether he was condemning his friend or pleading for something. I am not David. The middle-aged man stretched his finger behind his ear and moved it a few times. Then, he grabbed a piece of skin and flung it forward. A lifelike mask fell from his face. That was indeed not David. On the hazy cheeks, there was a pair of eyes that were not much bigger than soybeans. It was said that the smaller the eyes, the more spirited they were. But if they were too small, it would inevitably give people a vicious feeling. Moreover, his lips were very thin, and the slightly upturned corners of his mouth were full of ridicule. You! Schumann stretched out his trembling hand. He finally understood that David did not betray him. But in the process of tracking and investigating, he was discovered and tragically killed. Lord Schumann, we should have a good talk, shouldn't we? The person who impersonated David said coldly. Schumann turned his head abruptly and desperately fled in the direction he came from. In comparison, he felt that the white-haired old man was easier to deal with. At this moment, Schumann had already unleashed all his potential. In a few steps, he rushed in front of the old man and shouted, "Get out of my way!" Then, he swung his fist at the old man's head. The old man slowly turned his body sideways and returned a punch to Schumann. Schumann's fist was only a few feet away from the old man, but the old man had already hit Schumann's heart. Schumann suddenly hit the stone wall beside him. Large beads of cold sweat appeared on his head. His body also shrank down little by little. He opened his mouth wide as if he was desperately trying to breathe, like a dying fish. Want to run? Ha! The person who impersonated David slowly walked over and stood side by side with the old man. Actually, you don't have to be so nervous. I will ask you a few questions. As long as you can answer truthfully, I will not hurt you. What do you want to know? Schumann squeezed a few words from his throat with difficulty. It's very simple. Just some trivial things. The person who impersonated David said, "What do you usually like to eat for breakfast?" Schumann seemed to have woken up from a dream. He realized that before David was killed, He must have answered similar questions. That was why he could not discover that David was an impersonator. Thinking of this, Schumann knew that he could not escape death. His heart strangely calmed down. Then, he viciously spat a mouthful of saliva at the other party. This is not good. The person who impersonated David casually waved his torch and blocked Schumann's saliva. I advise you to cooperate with us obediently. You want to pretend to be me to deceive others? Dream on. Schumann had already made up his mind. His face suddenly showed a joyful expression. His gaze fell behind the two people. The two mysterious people turned their heads at the same time. Schumann suddenly jumped up and slammed his head against the stone wall. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.